45 minuti. Forse con un minuto di anticipo.
Maybe 1 minute earlier. I don't know. We can start the session of this afternoon. And so, with this session, we will examine the Bible in a literary production. As usual, after the first two lectures, there will be a short break, and then the last lecture of the afternoon. And after the third lecture, there will be the discussion. So the first lecture will be given by Professor Michele Cutino from the University of Strasbourg. Michele Cutino is president of CIRPAM, International Research Group on late antique and medieval poetry. Is among his other interests, and he will talk about the Heptateuchus, the Pseudo-Cyprian, and he will talk about Letia, Claudio Mario Vittorino. Vittorio. So, I think we can give the floor to Professor Cutino. I remind you, you have 45 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chair. So, it was thanks to Eric Auerbach that a code was developed with the instruments of the Greek Roman codes by involving the production, poetic production, and this was which connoted this tradition. So this delay of poetry reveals a real difficulty that is often reflected in statements by Christian intellectuals of radical incompatibility between the biblical theological horizon and poetry in particular as a privileged instrument of secular culture, and thus linked by the very notion of Carmen, in addition to mythology, to pagan religious poetry. The solution that emerged initially gave rise, to use Reinhard Herzog's expression, to the third cycle of poems in Western literature, alongside the Homeric and Carolingian Arthurian cycles, the cycle of biblical poetry in classical meters. This is a very important cultural tradition that, after encountering the prejudice of a certain classicist perspective, especially since the mid 20th century, has established itself in landscape of ancient and medieval studies because of its chronological transversality in European culture. The poetic canons, thus elaborated in late antiquity, dominated the medieval school and that of the humanistic period, as well as finding favor in the Reformation and Counter Reformation, regardless of the geographical area of reference, in a transnational and European dimension. While in the third quarter of the 20th century, the attention of scholars, particularly those of the German school, such as Klaus Dredd and Herzog, focused on the technicalities of translating pagan culture into biblical and Christian language with an emphasis on the categories of contrastive imitation or resemantization. In recent decades, studies on the transposition of the contents of the biblical tradition into poetic forms have instead focused on three extremely important factors. First point, this transposition is not reduced to a mere rhetorical exercise or literary lusus, as Michael Roberts and Daniel Nodes demonstrated. These transpositions, which offer readers a rereading of the biblical hypotext and updating of scripture in relation to the needs and expectations of the sociocultural context of reference, combine poetic rewriting with a hermeneutical and doctrinal perspective. So much so that one can speak of this type of compositions as a true theological poem rooted in the debates of its time, where theology does not exist as an autonomous science, but implies political and social repercussions, more precisely of an exegesis in verse that is accompanied by very specific theological goals. Indeed, the great novelty brought by Christianity to poetic composition in general is that of having developed the potential of a conjunctural, so to speak, extremely varied literary creation, whose primary function was a theological elaboration arising from the need to translate Judeo Christian categories into Greek Roman language and way of thinking, and from the dialectical relationship between heterodoxy and orthodoxy. It was this element that characterized the construction of Christian identity from the very beginning through the various Trinitarian, Christological, and ecclesiological questions in poetic production. Just think of how much Latin Christian hymnody with Victorinus, Hilary of Poitiers, and Ambrose of Milan owes to the iron question. This is the famous Reformatio in Malleus, theorized by Jacques Fontaine, 1988, as characteristic of Christian literature, especially poetry. Third point, this reformatio is evident in points such as Prudentius and Paulinus of Nola, who mark a difference in the meaning of literary creation in verse, which had often become a creation with a primarily ludic purpose, conceiving Christian consecration as a means to the end of the Christian faith. Um, so, with an existential dimension. So, I defer to the written um, version, the details of the status questionis on the value that this poetic genre has from the theological and history of ideas point of view. I merely note that to the study of this aspect in recent years, in particular, have made an important contribution the publication produced within the framework of an NRDFT project, the funding of which will end in June 2025, and more generally within the framework of the GIS Groupement d'intérêt scientifique, which I founded and coordinated together with Bruno Bureau. A general, at the end of the handout, you will find a general reference bibliography about these points, because so a specific, there is a general bibliography that can be useful while you wait for the written text. I've chosen to focus on a specific example of biblical rewriting in late antique Latin poetry, where we can grasp more immediately the sense of the operation performed by these poets. I've chosen the Latin sphere because in the Greek sphere, this approach is first of all less well documented, because biblical poetry in general is less known to us, and because this approach is much more discreet, as can be seen, for example, from the treatment to which none of Panopolis' subjects, the Gospel of John, in his famous paraphrase, have dealt with this exegetic rewriting several times. We can call it abnominal, so operated through some lexical. So the episode I chose is the one of the original sin, because I think it lends itself well to testing the extent to which a rewriting always constitutes beyond a greater or lesser degree of fidelity to the hypothetical, a reinterpretation of the model, a recreation of it, if you will. So we will see two late antique poems, the Optateuchos by Cyprian and the Alexia of Claudius Marius Victorius. Of the former, we still ignore almost everything, but most critics consider it the earliest Old Testament rewriting in verse that has come down to us. Whereas we can better place the Aletheia roughly in the second quarter of the 5th century and by 450. And above all, the author of Heptateuchos is unknown. On the contrary, we know that the author was a Marsilysian rhetorician. So let us proceed in order and let's illustrate the biblical text, which is the object of the paraphrases from point 1 AD, which you have according to the Vetus Latina text established by Fischer. In italicized the brackets, you will find the variants of Jerome's Vulgate. So let us begin with the antecedents. After creating man, God constitutes for him a garden paradise, and the biblical text specifies in Genesis 2:9 that in the center of the garden are particular trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When Adam is situated in paradise so that he can guard and cultivate it, God allows him to eat every fruit in a garden, with exception of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And to give force to this prohibition, God illustrates the consequences, speaking in plural, as if there were already Eve. To eat the fruit of this tree is, as the text says in the biblical style, equivalent to dying. Thus, we have the creation of woman after God found for Adam no better companion among other created beings. And of this episode, I have reproduced only the concluding verse, Genesis 2:25. The clarification there is that the progenitors lived naked in paradise, but were not ashamed of it. This concept is expressed in the Vetus with the nuance of demure blush. They did not blush. We then have the actual narration of the episode of the sin committed by the progenitors in Genesis 3:17. The serpent, whose great cunning superior to any other creature, the text emphasizes, slyly asks Eve a false question because God had forbidden them to eat the fruit of the trees in the garden. Eve points out that the prohibition concerns only the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of which will cause death. This is denied by the serpent, who points out to Eve that God had formulated this prohibition because if humans ate the fruit of this tree, their eyes will be opened, and knowing good and evil, they will be like God, indeed like God. The biblical text presents the plural. Then Eve realizes that the fruit is pleasing to the eye and that it is convenient to acquire knowledge of it and gives Adam to it. Alas, what the serpent had promised them is fulfilled. Their eyes are opened, but the acquisition of this faculty, translating into an awareness of good and evil, produces as its first consequence that the progenitors discovered themselves naked, whereas before they were naked and did not blush about it, and therefore they covered themselves with fig leaves. Let us first see how the Heptateuchos wrote this episode. The first element that attracts our attention is that the events of Genesis 2:8-17, which describe the formation of paradise and the presentation of the tree of knowledge, are postponed to verses 50-69 in order to allow for a homogeneous narrative of the creation, at the same time of man and woman, according to a perspective that merges the two accounts of the creation of man, the creation according to the image of 1:26-27, and the creation from the mouth of Genesis 2:7. This implies that God places both protoplast in Eden from the beginning and gives both of them the necessary instructions concerning the tree of good and evil to be avoided. Second observation, in fact, when he paraphrases in verses 50 to 53 the description of the particular trees of Eden in Genesis 2:9, our author, on the one hand, speaks of only one tree, which he defines as of life and death, evidently translating the alternative between good and evil of the tree of knowledge into a formula in which the tree of life and its opposite is included. On the other hand, he adds the specification of lethal fruit that anticipates the effects of the tree forbidden in God's words in Genesis 2:17. You shall die of that. When We then come to the prohibition imposed on the progenitors in verses 64. Here are divided in two pages. God authorizing them to eat of all lawful fruits invites them to be careful only not to choose the malum noxale quod viret ex gemino discreta dmunia suco. These are verses 68, 69. A first interpretive difficulty concerns these verses. First, for malum noxale, Maria Rosaria Petringa links the mention of this malum, interpreting it as apple, with that of verse 77, Felicia germina mali, where mali should come from malum, apple, given the long A of the syllable, and this despite the fact that malum of verses 68 as the short A instead, so it should rather be traced back to malum evil. The numerous prosodic licenses that the author allows himself with regard to the same words um, seem well to authorize the syllables is so. In fact, several commentators have understood the malum of verse 68 as malum, especially Shalmaz Gruber and Evans, and this is what I understood it in a contribution of 2016. The two interpretations, in any case, have to reckon with the relative that follows, and that is not of immediate intelligence. The expression ex gemino suco is referred by Petringa to the knowledge of good and evil, to which she would also allude discreta admonia for distinct functions. But the scholar does not pay attention to the fact that the tree in question, as we said in verse 52, is the tree of life and death, and that to connote this ambivalence of this, there is an expression very close to the Gemino Suco, verse 69, namely conjunctum generans vitae mortisque saporem. The duplicity, therefore, of these fruits depends on the fact that with different purpose they secrete life and death. Beyond this, it gives difficulty to the verb viret. If one understands it in a literal sense, greening, as Petringa translates and lets Schurmgruber claims in his commentary, it seems clear to me that it can refer to malum, apple, all in the case where the apple in question is green, a detail that is puzzling because the verb normally fits lush vegetation. If, on the other hand, one gives it a somewhat metaphorical meaning, flourishes, thrives, it is clear that the concordance with apple becomes even more problematic. I wonder at this point whether we should not think of a use of malum as an apple tree, a usage that is well attested and which would fully justify the viret of the relative, proving moreover homogeneous with respect to the malum of verse 77, as well as with respect to the presentation of verse 52, where it is the tree that generates a double aroma. Obviously, in this case, the verb lago will be understood in the sense of choose, worrying only about possibly not running into the noxious apple tree. This will be the translation of verse 69. Moreover, I personally continue to be of the opinion that the author, playing also in metrical license, wants to be deliberately ambiguous, as Schmalzgruber and especially McBride recognize, and about the most certain datum of verse 77. We would, in any case, be faced with the first attestation of the identification of the forbidden fruit with the apple, where the biblical text speaks generically of lignum. And we may, in any case, note that God's discourse on the consequences of eating the forbidden fruit in the Pentateuch is by no means as clear as it is in the biblical hypothetical. Death is not explicitly envisaged as a consequence of breaking the prohibition. The ambiguous nature of the tree to be guarded against is likewise not made explicit. But the novelties of the writing of the Pentateuch author certainly do not stop here. As a commentary on the prohibition given by God to man with an epic formula, Necominus Interea, indicating the unfolding of an event despite what was previously observed, um, note 3 of the handout, the author points out that the protoplasts were nonetheless blind, plunged into a deep night, and that garments did not yet cover their newly formed limbs. This clarification regarding the gloomy condition as an evidently proleptic function with respect to the words the serpent addresses to the woman in order to tempt her, of his complex argument in the biblical text tending to reassure the protoplast on the one hand that they would certainly not die, and on the other hand that on the contrary their eyes will be opened and they will become like God. The only element that is emphasized is the opening of the eyes of the progenitors. Verse 80, aureus estrigero ribedit cardine mundus, on which the author then consistently insists. When Eve succumbs and eats the of the forbidden tree, the heavens shine to her unclouded. Verse 84, ad fulsit nulla maculatum nube serenum. To Adam, induced by Eve to eat this fruit as well, swept away the darkness, glittering shine their eyes, serene for the shining universe. Verses 87 88. De terza nocte nitentes e mi quere oculi mundo splendente sereni. Once thus both have committed the offense, they turn their gaze to their naked bodies and cover their pudenda with fig leaves. This explains the connection in verses 71-72 between being blind, immersed in a dark night, and not feeling the need to cover their nakedness. At last, the protoplasts are no longer clouded by the deep night and see themselves naked, trying to cover themselves. This is another example of narratio probabilis. The author has favored certain details in his rewriting of the biblical narrative that he develops in a coherent and cohesive manner. But why this particular rewriting? What does the poet want to express? Maria Rosaria Petringa, in the wake of Leather, thinks that the blindness in question of the protoplast is to be understood in a proper, non metaphorical sense, according to a literal exegesis that in the Christian sources is attributed to heretics, particularly the Manichaeans, and that is judged in any case to be proper to a popular, uneducated approach to the text. You can, I draw your attention on De Civitate Dei 14, which is very interesting. Augustine talks about an imperitum vulgus opinatur, so an absolutely popular opinion. So this interpretation does not convince me. Too many inconsistencies and aphorisms arise from it, all of which will go in the opposite direction of the narratio probabilis usually taken by the author. So, in the logic of this rewriting, what what's the meaning of the fact that God entrusts the task of being guardian and cultivator of his garden, as stated in verse 64, not to mention the names already given by God to the animals. These are all elements which give no problems in the Heptategus author. They reproduces in the same way. Furthermore, we should pay attention to the fact that it is the devil who prospers to the protoplast that they will acquire sight if they eat of the tree, and it actually comes to pass. In light of this, if the blindness in question is a true physical impairment with which the protoplasts were created, without the author hinting at any explanation for it, this would implicitly make God appear unjust and cruel in light of his prohibition against eating of the tree. In short, God would want humans to remain in blindness, and on the contrary, the devil, who hints at the possibility of healing this impairment, would acquire an almost Promethean function. He gives humans what they are forbidden. If the protoplasts are really blind, it is clear that they finally see. This seems too much, even if one wants to postulate the presence in the Heptateuch poet of a popular, in the vulgar, uneducated sense of belief. Above all, however, this reading overlooks a particularly astounding fact of our text. Blindness concerns only celestial knowledge. It is not a tuku blindness, a sky unclouded by clouds, a clear and sharp vision of light, as opposed to darkness, is not blindness tukur. In fact, the serpent in verse 80 promises Eve that once she has eaten the forbidden fruit, the universe shining like gold will come to her with its starry vault. When Eve is eaten, shining before her are the serene spaces of heaven, untroubled by any cloud. The expression in verse 84, ad fulsit nulla maculatum nube serenum, manifestly picks up, as I noted in a contribution of 2016, a verse from a passage of the panegyric composed by Claudianus in 399 for the consulship of Mallius Theodorus, in which the poet juxtaposes the inner freedom of the newly appointed intellectual consul with the meteorological condition of Olympus, which, elevated as it is with its summit beyond the rainy zone, knows a perpetually clear sunny atmosphere, never clouded by clouds. When Adam then also eats the fruit, it is made clear in verses 87-88 that his eyes, cleared from the cleansed darkness, shine brightly before the splendor of the universe. And it is again not unnecessary to point out that when Adam is questioned by God about what he has done, the progenitor reports in verses 98 101 that the woman had assured him that liquidum serenum fulcis, an expression that mirrors the lexicon of verse 84. Ad fulcit nulla maculatum nube serenum, and these serene spaces of heaven are further explicated by Adam as the sun and the stars of heaven.
Insomma, tutti. In short, in all the passages, we are talking about the heavenly light that the protoplast can finally contemplate without anything obscuring it. So the high knocks in which they are immersed cannot and should not be understood as blindness to court. If this is the case, the basic question remains unanswered. What is the purpose of presenting the sin of protoplasts in this way? A possible interpretation is when we think of the author, we know that this is similar to the fact of being like God, of which the biblical hypothetical speaks. This assimilation has behind it a complex mental procedure made possible in the first place by what Ambrose of Milan notes in a passage from the Paradiso 1254 in the text 2c, in which he explains what the envy conceived by Satan in regard to man consists of, and the deception consequently enacted by him through a singular ethopeia reproducing demonic reasoning. The reason for envy is for Ambrosian the fact that man can hope for eternal bliss. And these opportunity and possibility reasons that demon, according to the Milanese bishop, is also an element of man's weakness because it craves greater things than in his condition. The deception wrought by the serpent, therefore, against man leans for Ambrose on his aspiration to be something more than what he is, even in the paradisical condition, namely to draw on the dimension of immortality. Now, this dimension of immortality proper to divinity in Scripture is associated with the possession of the inaccessible light spread in the set of the supreme God above in the heavens, dominated by a radiance that knows no dimming, as can be seen in an exemplary text such as Timothy 6:16, quotation in Latin. A text that soon becomes canonical in that context in Christian production, including poetry. This datum is in fact found in the Carme of uncertain deity, the Resurrectione Mortuorum, and especially in the so-called Poema Ultimum, a composition that seems to have a terminum antes or postquem in 389, in which is connoted with the images of the vivid cloudless light, inaccessible normally to man, not only the divine seed, but also the condition of immortality to which the believer aspires at the end of his life, as emerged from some passages towards imagery. The expressions of verses 84 and 87, 88 of our poem seem to be akin. To summarize the Pseudo Cyprian, in his rewriting has given of the opening of the eyes and the being as gods on which the temptation of the devil in the biblical text relies, a presentation as an aspiration to enjoy the inaccessible light possession of God alone as eternal. I'm not focusing on these rewriting. You will find some other documents in the written paper. I would like to notice rapidly that in the presentation and representation of the serpent, we have the envy and the lies as a main subject, but also the characterization of the serpent stressing a Virgilian element, which is corresponding to the adjectives spumeous, covered with slime, foam, slobbery, highlighted by the long trajectio in the verses 73-74. Moreover, Eve is the recipient of the temptation because this is implicitly evoked by the fact that her sub pectore, corda, are qualified as mollia. Such an adjective is manifestly part of a long Christian literature tradition emphasizing Eve's weakness in relation to Adam in an allegorical key in Ambrose's De Paradiso. Eve is the sensation, Adam the reason, in which the mention of infirmo sensu in verse 82 also enters. And finally, Eve includes and induces Adam to eat because she wants him to share in the pleasure derived from eating such a delicious fruit. I turn to Claudio Mario Vittorio's rewriting of the same biblical passages. We have to note, first of all the author's faithfulness to the biblical dictate in his presentation of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is quite distinct in verses 264-68 from the tree of life, as well as in his formulation of God's prohibition against feeding on the tree of knowledge on pain of the death to which the protoplast would incur. It is interesting that Mario Vittorio has God himself make explicit in verses 3, 21, 23 the reasons for the prohibition of approaching the fruit of his tree of the dual nature. It is true that the protoplast would know good, but together with it also evil, and his knowledge could only take the form of a crime worthy of punishment. And on this knowledge of God and good and evil, is fully centered the temptation of the devil in verses 398 405. He who does not know evil in his reasoning cannot even know what is good. God, in fact, does not want the protoplast to have this knowledge because otherwise, once they solve the fog of their spirit, they would really say that is no and be like gods. Noting these verses, the presence in the demon's speech of the metaphor of the darkness enveloping the progenitors, which would be dissolved by the eating of the forbidden fruit, a metaphor that has points of contact with the imagery we examine in the rewriting of the Eptateukos, verses 402-03, Ne mentis rubere moda dentanimis oculos, in which, however, the metaphorical value is made explicit, the eyes of the mind and the cloud enveloping intelligence are mentioned, and above all, seeing is especially and explicitly connected to the knowledge of good through that of its opposite, evil, which is interdicted by God, so that man cannot be like him. In short, demonic temptation is also gnosiological here, and it is made explicit and related to the specific characteristics of the forbidden tree, that of the knowledge of good and evil, which is not evoked at all in the rewriting of the Heptateukos. But what particularly characterizes this rewriting is the fact that Mario Vittorio dwells on the plural of the expression used by the demon, you will be like gods. He, in fact, takes advantage of it to make what he technically calls a brief excursus, escurrere Paulum. The parenthesis includes only verses 407, 411, as is well known, one of the modes of amplification in the rewriting of a hypotext. The license to insert these parentheses is sought in particularly refined formal ways that know the archaic fuat, which is found in Filone, identifying the serpent as the author of polytheism, and also a passage from Ambrose de Paradiso that I have reproduced in note number 10 that gives us a perfect account of this. But what is more important is that the excursus, in fact, constitutes a proactive anticipation of one of the fundamental ideological principles that informs Mario Vittorio's rewriting and the compositional structure of the Alicia itself, namely the progressive diversion of the true faith toward pagan cults that occurs as a result of Adam's sin, and to which the return to the true faith through God's covenants with the patriarch, and in particular, beginning with Abraham, reacts. This is an aspect precisely spelled out in the work's preface, Prefatio, in verses 103 111, in which the return of truth that justifies the very title of the poem is identified with the return of the original true faith. We have the Mario Vittorio's rewriting and his willingness to delve into the psychology of the characters in original ways. For example, Mario Vittorio does not refer to Eve's weakness, but rather to her being careless, clueless, and credulous. And moreover, the temptation she in turn exerts on Adam does not stem from the intent to share a pleasure, but rather rises from a consciousness that she has already independently developed of having sinned, from a remorse that already makes its way into her, for which she seeks comfort in guilt through Adam's co-responsibility. Solacia culpa querit. The latter, on the other hand, if you will, is further deresponsibilized. In verse 414 is in fact called facilis, yielding. Moreover, he is subjugated by a dual enemy, oste subactus a gemino cedit, by the serpent indirectly and directly by the woman. He reproduces the same arguments as Satan, from whom he is defined by the poet miserabilis, worthy of compassion. The serpent, on the other hand, is presented with quick notations that also have their own importance. His harmful intentionality is well emphasized by the fact that he is stimulated by the venom of worse evil, with obvious reference to the fact that he, having himself defected from the Creator, meditates an even greater evil to drag the progenitors into guilt as well. To his deceitful and fraudulent character is referred to by the mention of the fraudulent aspect of his speech, and far more modest is its characterization as an actual serpent. But what is most worth noting is that Mario Vittorio dwells at length on the effects of the protoplast infraction, namely the consequences that flow immediately after they both eat the forbidden fruit. They are immediately aware of the crime they have committed and therefore feel fear and shame. So the progenitors feel the need to cover themselves. Mario Vittorio recovers only at this point in the narrative the fact that in the Genesis, the man before went naked without feeling the need for clothing, and tries to account for this important change in perspective that had always attracted the attention of exegetes. To cite just a few examples, Irenaeus attributes Adam's act to fear of disobedience and the realization that he is now unworthy before God. Then Didymus the blind interprets the fig leaves as a sign that they had become aware that they had lost their primitive innocence because of the original sin. The symbolic interpretation of Genesis 3 7 is also taken into account by Augustine in his Ad Litteram exegesis of Genesis. Victor, on the other hand, makes no allusion to the theological problem involved in these metamorphoses related to concupiscence which burst into man's limbs as a consequence of original sin. The sense of shame that Adam and Eve feel after they become aware of the sin they have committed is traced by the poet, first and foremost, in a natural way, to the loss of the contemplative condition in which before sin they, being totally immersed, gave no thought to their material condition or of the condition of immortality from which benefiting they perceived no need. After the energy of eternal life leaves them, thus Mario Vittorio observes, the two, feeling cold and heat in contact with the air, understand that they have now become mortal. First of all, some conclusions. The two rewritings show quite clearly how difficult it is to categorize the various forms of biblical paraphrase into set forms. In fact, usually the Heptateuch passes for being a fairly faithful paraphrase adherent to the hypertext to which no substantial changes are allowed, whereas Mario Vittorio, in accordance with the type of didactic poem that aims to illustrate the truth through the biblical dictation of a part of Genesis, is cited as an example of a paraphrase that strays far from the tenor of the hypertext. In fact, the situation is far more complex and articulated. The rewriting of the event of the sin of the progenitors shows a more unfaithful rewriting which merges the details of the symbolic trees of Eden, which modifies the substance and form through which the temptation is exercised, than that of Mario Vittorio, in which substantially all the basic elements of the Genesian narrative are found. Rather, our attention should be drawn to the way in which this greater or lesser degree of freedom and fidelity to the source text is formally expressed. The Heptateuch Dictator implements his interventions on the diegetic plane by constructing a narratio probabilis, and his rewriting is therefore particularly dense, and often this density involves aspects that are difficult to evaluate. Mario Vittorio is fundamentally respectful of the scriptural plot. What interests him is to bring out the deep meaning of the story told through the tools that rhetoric makes available to him, from digressions, excursus to commentary notes articulated according to an argumentative hierarchy. So, one can speak in this case of exegetical paraphrase. We can also speak of theological interpretation manifesting itself in the very act of rewriting. Well, this is a question. It seems to me that the two rewritings I have provided here adequately show this, if only one gives the term theology an obviously non systematic or dogmatic meaning. It seems clear to me that in both compositions the authors propose their own version of the error of the protoplasts, born from the aspiration to a limpid vision of things, which is denied them in the Heptateuch Dicta, sprung from the aspiration to truth, namely to the knowledge of good and evil, to be like God, which results in the polytheistic error in the Aletheia of Mario Vittorio. In both cases, we are confronted with a reading of a scriptural text that leans discreetly or contemporary, to put it mildly, professional exegesis. Indeed, the proposed interpretation of the guilt of the proto-parents in both cases is outside of the theological considerations that are dominant in 5th century ecclesiastical debate. In this, I believe that we should appreciate the autonomous space that rewriting Old Testament history allowed the poets, quite unlike the Gospel, to propose wholly original keys to interpreting the narrated event and to carry out complex operations of inclusion of the biblical Christian horizon in the classical literary perspective. One cannot fail to notice the insistence in the two rewritings proposed on the idea of the boundary between the divine and the human that the progenitors break, an idea that allowed a perfect encounter with the classical mythological elaborations that went in this direction, and to frame the biblical story, as I have shown in some articles currently being published, in the pagan account of the different ages of progressive decline of human history. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Coutinho, for this interesting analysis on the on very special exegesis that we will discuss during the discussion. So we are 2 minutes earlier than the schedule, and so we can give the floor to the second speaker, Professor Dinkova Brun. So we do not have the handout, but a PowerPoint only.
Allora, sì, io carico la sveglietta. Dunque, allora possiamo iniziare.
So we can start with the second lecture. Professor Grete Dinkova-Brun, director of the library of the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto. She is director of the Journal of Medieval Latin, and she deals with biblical poetry, Latin medieval, and at the moment she's working on the edition of the Aurora by Pietro Riga. The lecture of this afternoon is entitled Latin Biblical Poetry between the 7th and 11th centuries. Where are the epics? So we give the floor to Professor Dinkova-Brun.
First of all, like everybody before me, I would like to thank the organizers for including me in this incontro, for really giving me the opportunity to reconnect with old friends, to make new friends, to learn all sorts of things from all of you, and to get to know this beautiful city of Spoleto. Il ponte, questo ponte sarà famoso.
The bridge, this bridge will be famous. I've already sent it to the old world.
Biblical poetry between the 7th and the 11th century. When the organizing scientific committee of this year's Settimana assigned to me the topic of Latin biblical poetry between the 7th and the 11th centuries, and we should add to this title in the West, I realized immediately that this was not going to be an easy task. The inherent difficulty of this topic is twofold. On the one hand, there is the problem of terminology, namely, what is meant by the term biblical poetry? And on the other, there is the issue of chronology, as the period in question, from the 7th to the 11th century, it's of a peculiar nature, slotted squarely between the relatively well-defined cultural continuum of the late antiquity and the important turning point represented by the social and cultural developments of the vibrant 12th century and its famous Renaissance. In addition, because of the enormous amount of works to be considered, it is evident that only the main tendencies can be outlined in this talk, and only the most unusual poems can be afforded a slightly more detailed attention. Let us start then with determining what we mean by biblical poetry. This is not as straightforward as one might imagine, and some important terminological boundaries must be adopted here. First and foremost, it has to be stated that in our context, biblical poetry does not signify the poetry of the Bible or the poetry in the Bible. Some of the best examples of poetic texts included in the Bible are, of course, the Psalms and the sapiential books of Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, and the Lamentations of Jeremiah. But there are also several other large sections of poetry and canticles found in Holy Scripture, especially in the books of the prophets. This is clearly not what we have in mind when we talk about biblical poetry in the post-biblical period, be it late antiquity, the Middle Ages, the pre-modern, or the modern times. In the terms proposed by Gérard Genette in his work titled Palimpsest, the Bible is the hypotext. This has been already used, this term, but I want to insist that it was Genette who invented this terminology. So the Bible is the hypotext which serves as the basis and inspirations for the literary genre of biblical poetry that develops after it. Our corpus of biblical poetry is thus exclusively composed of hypertexts, which, however, can be and are very different in the way they position themselves in relationship to their common biblical progenitor. As poetic rewriting of scripture, therefore, the corpus of biblical poetry under consideration here comprises a variety of poetic manifestations which can be studied and analyzed from different perspectives such as genre and length, language and place of composition, versifying techniques and meter, audience and purpose. In most general and broad terms, the enormous corpus of medieval biblical poetry can be divided into three major categories which take into account both formal characteristics and the general context of usage, purpose, and audience. The first group comprises works that engage with the Bible as a narrative account of the history of humankind. Here we can include, on the one hand, works that are very long and ambitious in scope and often sprawling in length, covering many biblical books, both in the Old and the New Testament. These works are normally referred to as biblical epics, even though the term has been debated and continues to be debated, and I prefer to call them full-scale biblical versifications rather than biblical epics, because epic already invokes some expectations that we don't find in our texts. So I prefer to call them full-scale biblical versifications or simply verse rewritings of the Bible. In addition, we have also shorter narrative carmina that are dedicated to a single biblical episode, a single biblical book, or a particular biblical theme, such as, for instance, the very popular motif of the 6 days of creation, which constitutes an entire important subgroup of hexameral poems. The works in this category, I mean the narrative category, both the full-scale log accounts and the carmina, are written predominantly in quantitative verse, generally hexameters, and elegiac couplets, and they have a strong connection to education, scholarly exegesis, and literary ambition. The second group comprises the vast corpus of lyrical verse, as well as the great variety of liturgical genres, such as hymns, sequences, and rhyme prayers, which are examples of what we can call affective poetry, that is characterized with the clear orientation towards expressing the emotional piety of both the poet and the audience. This group of biblical poems are primarily written in diverse types of rhythmic verse, even though quantitative meters could also be used for writing hymns. It also needs to be mentioned that some narrative biblical poetry could be written in rhythmic verse. There is no exclusion here, but this is rather an exception in the period under discussion here. The example is the 9th century Benedictine monk Adalbert of Prüm, I think I have who composed his De Creatione Mundi per Ordinem Dierum Sex in 285 Pharecretian verses. If you have never heard of these verses, don't worry. This is a type of aeolic meter that I have no time to explain here, but if you're interested, a very clear description is provided in D.S. Raven's Latin meter. Liturgical poetry, on the whole, it's a special case in which the biblical content is refracted through the prism of ritual and performance, which in the process adds a layer of personal, often even dramatic involvement that is very different from the tenor of the more scholarly and didactically bent biblical versifications discussed in the first group. The third group comprises what we can call the micro forms of biblical poetry. Here we can include all short pieces that are epigrammatic in nature, even though short, a few verses normally, and denoted with the general term tituli. Generally, not all of these pieces are the same. Some are independent epigrams on various biblical motifs, figures, and events, while others, called versus ad picturas, are used as captions for works of art, manuscript images, or church decoration. These short poems are frequently collected in poetic anthologies found in several medieval manuscripts, but we also see individual pieces copied in the margins and other blank spaces in the codices. In the cases when the verses possess a clear mnemonic focus, they can also be referred to as versus memoriales. The verse tituli are written predominantly in hexameters and elegiac couplets. In addition to these three major categories of biblical verse, namely, 1, the epico-narrative, 2, the lyrical and liturgical performative, and 3, the micro-epigrammatic, they are poems directly or indirectly inspired by the Bible that are so unique and experimental that they do not fit into the proposed classificational paradigm. One example here are the so-called secondary biblical paraphrases, which can be defined as biblical narratives contained in works of largely non-biblical character. Because of time constraints, I will not explore this corpus of works in which the ekphrasis, the biblical ekphrasis, is the most typical manifestation. But to return to the topic at hand, biblical poetry from the 7th to the 11th century. As the period is illuminated by the bright star of the Carolingian Renaissance right in the middle, I have divided the period into 3 subsections: the pre-Carolingian times, 7th century, Carolingian period, 8th and 9th centuries, and post-Carolingian period, 10th and 11th centuries. Of course, these chronological divisions are not as clear-cut in reality, and phenomena, developments, and especially the works of anonymous authors straddle temporal boundaries and do not cease or begin following chronological decades and centuries. Still, while keeping this caveat in mind, it is useful to adopt a rough contemporary framework for this long period of 5 centuries in order to understand better the literary currents of the various temporal segments. Starting with the 7th century, we must acknowledge right away that the landscape of biblical poetry is rather desolate. We have one flicker of light in faraway Spain in the person of Archbishop Eugenius of Toledo II, or Eugenius Secundus, who died in 657. Eugenius was a prolific poet, having compiled a poetic anthology called Libellus Carminum, which comprises 101 poems on a variety of topics, mostly representing the short epigrammatic style, and using a large diversity of meters. Only 3 of these pieces are related to the Bible, number 8, 37, and 38, with the versus in bibliotheca, bibliotheca of course meaning the Bible, as we all know, representing the precursor of the same genre that becomes very influential in the following centuries, as seen in the poems with the same name composed by the Carolingian luminaries Alcuin and Theodulf. In addition, Eugenius also produced a very successful revision version of the De Laudibus Dei, composed by his 5th century predecessor, Dracontius. All in all, I say successful not because it is a wonderful rewriting, but because it was copied and studied. When you read it, it's a little bit weird, but okay, just a couple. All in all, Eugenius's biblical production, it's not vast. It rather constitutes the exception that confirms the sad reality that Latin biblical production in the 7th century is almost non-existent as far as what has been preserved to the present day. Things changed dramatically in the 8th and the 9th centuries during the cultural and literary revival of the Carolingian period. From Francesco Stella's magisterial La Poesia Carolingia Latina, Tema Biblico, we know that suddenly there is a huge amount of biblical poetry to be examined and analyzed. If we look at the entire corpus, there are a few important observations that must be made immediately. First, despite all the activity of the field of biblical poetry, the Carolingian period does not produce any large-scale biblical epics in Latin of the type that were created in late antiquity. There is no new Juvencus, new Sedulius, new Avitus, new Orator in this period. A possible explanation could be that the Latin world was reading the already canonized corpus of late antique biblical epics while simultaneously developing new literary interests and poetic tastes. Still, I do not want to give you the impression that the genre of epic poetry disappears, vanishes during the Carolingian period. Not at all. However, the content of the epic compositions now changes from biblical to hagiographical, with several saints' lives being rendered in epic verse form. But there are no verse Bibles in the Carolingian period of what we have in late antiquity and what we will have in the 12th and 13th century. Interestingly, though, the situation is quite the opposite in the vernacular realm. First, in the 8th century, several great biblical epics, all anonymous, were written in Old English. Two of them, the so-called Genesis A and Daniel, even predate the famous Beowulf. In the late 8th and the early 9th century, the Anglo-Saxon Exodus appears, and there are also addenda to Genesis A, called Genesis B, obviously, written in the 9th century. In brief, we are dealing with a sizable corpus of Old English biblical poetry of the epic style at the same time when no new Latin biblical epics are in sight at all. It seems that while the Latin world is happy to continue reading the late antique biblical works, the Anglo-Saxon poets were trying to establish a similar tradition in their own native language. The same phenomenon is observed also on the continent, where two important works were composed at the Abbey of Fulda. First, the extensive, even though now fragmentary, Old Saxon Heliand, Savior, a rewriting of the Gospel story in Germanic heroic style, which has been linked to the commentary on the Gospels of Matthew by Rabanus Maurus. And second, the work of Ottfried of Weissenberg, a student of Rabanus, who wrote in Old High German a huge gospel harmony, now referred to as Das Evangelienbuch. Professor Haubrichs will tell us more about these fascinating works in his intervention after me, but I only want to state here that all vernacular poems are written in alliterative verse, even though I want to stress that there is a clear difference between the interests of the Old English poets who engage with the Old Testament and their Germanic colleagues at Fulda who concentrate on the gospel story. I'm sure that Professor Heibrich will tell us why. Old English biblical verse continues to be composed in the post-Carolingian period as exemplified by the anonymous Judith, dated to the 10th century. I find this fascinating, absolutely fascinating, that the void has been filled by vernacular epics. Great. You might be expecting that, okay, there are no Latin biblical epics in the Carolingian period, but surely, Greti, there is a lot of Carmina. No, There are no narrative carmina either. We have only 2 examples of quantitative poems on biblical themes. One is Floros of Lyon, theologian, liturgist, and poet, whose corpus of poetry comprises 30 poems. Among them, 7 are inspired by the Bible, and you have them on the slide, 3 by the gospel narrative, 2 by Psalms 22 and 27, and 1 by the book of Daniel. The last 3 of these poems are he himself calls epigrams. In addition to Floros, we have 2 metrical renditions of the Psalter, of Psalms, one anonymous comprising 1,885 hexameters, but still incomplete, and one by Archbanus, of whose versification only a short fragment is preserved. This high concentration of versifications on the Psalms, either individually or collectively, it's especially noteworthy. Considering the fact that the Psalms are already poetic texts, rendering them in Latin verse, be it metrical or rhythmical, raises important questions about what role was medieval versification really expected to play. It is easier to understand transforming prose into verse, but when verse is changed into a different type of verse, this suggests that the process of the new verse rendition must have carried an additional significance and benefit, probably linked to the afforded opportunity to incorporate into the biblical texts allegorical and moral interpretations. In a sense, the poetry in the Bible was not perceived as different from the prose in the Bible. Both textual registers were treated in the same way and reworked through the same theological and exegetical lens. The second tendency observed in the Carolingian period is the increased interest in writing rhythmical poetry. In fact, this is the golden time for Latin lyrical expression, both biblical and not biblical. And perhaps this tendency is one of the reasons why quantitative Bible poetry takes a step back amid such fervent rhythmical creativity. Here, I will offer just a few remarks on the Carolingian rhythmi. They are divided by Francesco Stella into 4 thematic classes. The first one comprises paraphrastic pieces whose general characteristic is that they rewrite exclusively biblical episodes and never large sections of the Bible, as is normal in the metric sector. They also remain within the framework of the biblical text without an added exegetical layer. This is instead done in the second group of poems, which are defined as exegetical rhythmi. The third class comprises the poems exhibiting a theological character, and the fourth are those with a Christological orientation. The vast majority of rhythmical poetry is anonymous, but 3 names should be remembered in this context. The later Paulinus of Aquileia, or Paulinus of Aquileia Secundus, Rabanus Maurus, and Notker Paulus. At this point, I would like to mention one of the most unique rhythmical compositions produced in this time, known as the Cena Cipriani. It is true that the prose text was written in around 400 AD, but its verse life begins in the Carolingian period, so it definitely belongs here. The versification of the Cena Cipriani was done by John the Deacon in the 9th century and reworked twice in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. The Cena, in its various versions, tells the story of the wedding feast at Cana, to which many biblical characters are invited. The host of the feast is Quidam Rex nomine Joel, a certain king named Joel. The guests are numerous, the dishes lavish, the presents are numerous, and amusements manifold. The only thing that disturbs the good cheer is the discovery on the second day of the feast that some precious objects have been stolen. As a result, the king orders that all guests are interrogated. At the end, the only one who is blamed for the stealing is Camry's son Ahan, who is indeed depicted as a thief in the Bible, in the book of Joshua, after the fall of Jericho. Because of his crime, Ahan is executed and buried. If this is a strange scenario to begin with, everything becomes even more bizarre when the reader realizes that all of these events are only a pretext to provide lists of names of biblical personages who are paired with objects, locations, or actions which a reader who knows the Bible would typically associate with them. For example, if we look at Samson, he is seated on columns, takes the jaw of an animal cooked for the guests, offers honey to Pilate, gives a lion as a present to the king, and is bound in chains at the end when the king tries to find out who among his visitors has stolen from him. The lion, the honey, the jaw, the columns, the chains are all words that cannot fail to invoke in the reader's mind the story of the glorious and tragic life of the Old Testament judge. The associations are not original per se, and yet no other medieval composition achieves the effect of the Cena. It is funny and instructive, parodistic and earnest, mnemonic and memorable. The biblical characters are introduced here both in their usual context and in a setting that is completely surprising. The poem is simply unforgettable. I encourage you all to read it. It is fantastic. This short excursus on the Cena Cipriani leads me to my final observation about the Carolingian period, which is that this is a time in which we find a great variety of poetic expression. The use of rhythmical poetry spreads, secular poetry blossoms, classical models are actively imitated, and biblical poetry shows a general preference for the short and epigrammatic forms, while at the same time producing some unusual poetic works, such as the already discussed Cena and the Virgilian Ecloga by Theodulus, a singing context between falsehood, pseustis, defending Greek myth, and truth, aletheia, countering his examples of valor and morality with episodes from the Old Testament. The Ecloga is a very influential work, which I do not have time to discuss today. The date of the composition of the work is also a little bit uncertain, but for the time being, I have chosen to include it in the Carolingian biblical corpus, even though some colleagues think it is a little bit later. The Carolingian period, as can be expected from a Renaissance, represents a high point in the production of biblical poetry. In the 10th century, things quiet down a little bit, or quite a bit. There are indeed only two authors whose compositions deserve inclusion in this survey, Odo of Cluny and Flodoard of Reims. Odo's Occupation, or Occupatio, it's a poem of 5,580 hexameters, composed by the second abbot of Cluny in the first half of the 10th century. The work, preserved in a single late 10th, early 11th century manuscript in the Bibliothèque d'Arsenal in Paris, is divided into 7 books with a preface. Books 1 and 2 we deal with the creation of angels, of the angels and the man. Book 3 and 4 recount the sins of the human race after the expulsion from paradise, the flood, the destruction of Sodom, and the institution of the Mosaic Law. Book 5 and 6 tell the story of Christ's incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. And finally, Book 7 describes the evil tendencies of Odo's own age and the expected arrival of the Antichrist. He is coming, Odo says. This last book is in line with Odo's efforts as a church reformer. The somewhat rambling and linguistically pretentious Occupatio remains generally unknown and understudied, exercising as little impact today as it did in the Middle Ages. Maybe this will change with the new edition and translation, which is about to appear next month as one of the publications of the Journal of Medieval Latin. The poem of the French chronicler Flodoard of Reims, called De Triumphis Christi, cannot be more different, even though it also has a very slight dissemination, only one 10th century manuscript and one 17th century copy of the 10th century manuscript. The De Triumphis, composed between 925 and 937, comprises almost 20,000 verses, and it's divided into 3 sections in which the poet describes how Christ has saved the world through the agency of his apostles, martyrs, and saints. Section 1, in 3 books, talks about the triumphs of the Savior in Palestine. Section 2, divided into 2 books, recounts Christ's wondrous deeds in Antioch. And finally, section 3, De Triumphis Christi Apud Italiam, which is by far the largest one, describes in 14 books the Christian triumphs in Italy, following a Christological order and showing the poet's great familiarity with his subject matter. Even though I have included Flodoard's De Triumphis in the corpus of biblical poetry, the work is only loosely connected to the actual text of the Bible and presents much more and represents much more an example of verse hagiography, especially in section 3, Apud Italiam. We have lots of saints doing all sorts of wondering things there. Still, there is a biblical content in this poem, dispersed throughout the text, and the poet, especially when the poet engages with historical events related to the biblical narrative, often borrowed from Flavius Josephus. All in all, the 10th century is still basking in the afterglow of the Carolingian Renaissance, reading and using the texts produced by the poets of the previous 2 centuries, with very few new compositions appearing on the scene, both in Latin and in the vernacular. But the 11th century is different. During the 11th century, interest in writing biblical poetic works with a larger scope than the Carmina or Tituli begins to increase again. With their compositions, the 11th century poets prepared the ground for the huge wave of biblical versifications that would appear in the following centuries. Unfortunately, despite their undeniable importance, few of these poets have entered the traditional canon of medieval Latin literature, as was the case also with the poets of the 10th century, for that matter. And this accounts for the false impression that there is a break in the tradition of Latin biblical poetry between the Carolingian period and the early 12th century. The reality is very different, however, and in the time I have left, I hope to show you how vibrant and exciting the 11th century truly is. The poets in this century take new poetic challenges and incorporate in their works scholarly content to a much higher degree than their Carolingian predecessors. There is a gradual shift now towards making biblical poetry out of scriptural commentary, a didactic and scholarly bent that will blossom in the 12th and the 13th centuries by infusing biblical poetry with learning and making it a suitable teaching tool. The 11th century biblical poems that have larger scope, if not always length, exhibit three different approaches to the biblical narrative. Such work as the De Nuptiis Christi et Ecclesiae by Fulcoius of Beauvais and the Planctus Evae by Henry of Augsburg represent ambitious versifications that deal with the traditional fall redemption theme in a new setting and form. These two poems deserve some attention. They really do. Nobody knows them. They really are splendid. First, they are both written in the so-called Leonine rhyming hexameters, a new type of verse scheme that is a medieval invention and hugely popular. If a classical poet would avoid rhymes in his hexameters at any cost, the medieval poets were proud of being able to rhyme well. I have always wondered if this attitude is not influenced by the rhythmical poetic mode that has such a strong presence in medieval poetic discourse. Let me introduce you very briefly to the contents of the De Nuptiis and the Planctus. Fulcoius's poem, composed around 1070, it's one of the major achievements of its time. It represents a dialogue of epic proportions between Homo et Spiritus. Book 1 covers the large part of Genesis. Book 2 engages with Exodus 1:20 and some passages from Numbers and Deuteronomy. Book 3, 4, and 5 summarize the books of Kings and Paralipomenon, and Book 6 is based on Matthew 1:2 and Luke 1:2. Finally, Book 7 tells the rest of the gospel narrative, largely based on Matthew, ending with the martyrdom of Stephen. The poem draws upon other biblical books as well, namely the Psalms, the Pauline epistles, and the Apocalypse. Because of its marriage theme, Fulcoius's De Nuptiis could be related also to the tradition of the Cantica Canticorum commentary, even though it does not make any large use of the text of the Song of Songs. This is truly a very interesting work. We also should think about Marcianus Capella and another wedding theme involved here. The Planctus Eve by Henry of Augsburg, it's found in 3 12th century manuscripts, 2 of which in Vienna. The Vienna manuscripts, which are not descriptive of each other, preserve 2 different versions of the text, which engages in a novel way with the all-important doctrine of redemption. The Planctus was used as a teaching tool at the cathedral school in Augsburg. Its main source, its beads, hexameron for the narrative parts. Again, it was, as was the case with Fulcoius, Henry's poem deserves much more attention than what it's received so far. Both poets are talented and innovative, erudite, and unusual. The second versificational approach, detected in the 11th century, is seen in the verse commentary on the Cantica Canticorum by Williram of Ebersberg and one anonymous verse commentary on the Psalms from Tours. These poems represent a new trend in the genre of biblical versification, namely the rendering in poetic form of a systematic commentary on one and just one specific book of the Bible. Williram poems, it's 1,655 Leonine hexameters based on Hymos and Oratio in Cantica Canticorum, and the Tours commentary on the Psalms are the first examples of this approach. Many more poets followed suit in the 12th and the 13th centuries. The third approach is exemplified by 2 anonymous poems, the Liber Generationis Jesu Christi, Filii David, Filii Abraham, and the Liber Prefigurationum Christi et Ecclesiae. The composition and contents of both these poems make them very suitable for introducing a student to the basic principles of medieval exegesis. For example, the Liber Generationis presents each of Jesus' ancestors 3 times, historialiter, moraliter, and spiritualiter, while the Liber Prefigurationum proposes to reveal the 1,000 ways in which the Old Testament prefigures the incarnation of Christ, creating in the process a compendium of biblical typology and allegory. This trend towards writing biblical exegesis in verse on large proportions of the Bible became very popular and was developed even further in the 12th and the 13th centuries. In addition to these larger projects, some important biblical carmina need to be mentioned here. Those are written by the already mentioned Wiliram and Fulcoius. Wiliram's carmina explained and comment upon different scriptural passages, mostly from the Book of Kings. These short poems prove again that the 11th century was the starting point for many of the poetic developments that become prominent in the 12th and the 13th centuries. On the one hand, Wiliram's detached fragments of biblical commentary were only the first step in the long process of creative writing that culminated in Peter Riga's Aurora. On the other hand, versus memoriales, very similar to Wiliram's verse, were written continuously until well into the 15th century. Fulcoius' approach is different. I'm just trying to show you how fundamental the 11th century is to everything that happens after that, even though not known. Fulcoius' approach is different. His biblical carmina are in the form of moralizing verse letters to his friends or to some officials. Many of these letters contain biblical allusions, but 3 deal almost entirely with biblical events. For example, Fulcoius' letter 9, it's addressed to an adulterous friend whose virtue the poet is trying to strengthen by telling him the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife from Exodus. Letter 10, written in support of priestly marriage and against shameful lust, provides biblical examples of how impossible it is for a man to withstand the womanly charms, citing Zorobabel, Moses, David, and Ammon. And finally, letter 11 compares William the Conqueror with both Jephthah and his daughter. It is important to mention also that Fulcoius is among the very few biblical poets who successively combine scripture and classical learning. I have just a few comments, conclusions. Lawrence of Durham in the 12th century will be another one. I'm gonna jump a little bit here. Let me conclude. Even though I have raced through 5 centuries, I have not been able to explore in great detail the vast corpus of biblical poetry produced in this period. There are still some important characteristics that need to be remembered. First, there are no long biblical epics in Latin produced between the 7th and the 11th century. 2, the Germanic vernacular languages contribute significantly to fill in that particular lacuna. 3, since the 9th century, the rhythmical poetry is on the rise, with new poetic forms being created and elaborated upon. 4, the period is characterized by several highly original poetic creations, which proliferate especially during the Carolingian Renaissance and the 11th century. And 5, the rhyming Leonine hexameters emerge as the preferred meter of several of the 11th century's poets and will continue to be used in the centuries to follow on par with the non-real meter variety. From everything presented today, it becomes evident that the medieval verse Bible, both in Latin and in the vernacular, It's a multifaceted phenomenon which needs to be approached with the awareness that reading and writing practices in the medieval ages and the modern period differ in what they expect the audience to know and how poetic sensibilities intertwine with concerns about salvation and eternal life. Understanding the message of the Bible is of paramount importance, and putting this message into verse, be it narrative, mnemonic, didactic, or liturgical, it's a way to capture and honor its significance through the melody, beauty, and expressiveness of the Sermo Metricus. Rewriting the Bible in verse is a particular mode of textual reception in which scriptural meaning, literary quality, and cognitive technologies are combined for the benefit of the Christian reader. Biblical poets are thus always in the middle of a creative storm, in which the process of textualizing and conceptualizing scripture not only go hand in hand, but also sometimes drive the poetic idiom in contradictory directions. This is why the medieval biblical versifications often defy easy classification and go against of what a modern reader of poetry would expect to find in a poem. But is this not precisely why we love them so much? Thank you.
Adesso ci fermiamo per la pausa.
Thank you. Now we'll take a break. We will resume in 15 minutes at 5:15.
Non suona. Allora riprendiamo.
Okay, so we can resume with the last lecture of this afternoon. So I've been told that I have to say that after the discussion at the end of the lecture, there will be the presentation of the GSM Open Access portal. And so we will remain here for the presentation of the portal at the end of the discussion. So, the lecture by Professor Wolfgang Habrit entitled Three Carolingian Bible Poems in Their Historical and Functional Context.
Frankish Liber Evangeliorum ci porta verso il contesto.
So we will talk about the area where the professor works, the topics he deals with, and so German poetry. And we give the floor to Professor Wolfgang. You have 45 minutes.
Bible epics in vernaculars, pre-mentioned by Mrs. Grady. One preliminary remark. I prepared a handout. If you don't have the handout, it's better so. If you don't have the handout, here are some.
Se qualcuno non ha l'handout, ci sono altre copie.
Fine, I'm beginning. Bible translation into the vernacular language of the Germanic gentes or peoples like Franks, Bavarians, Alamans, and Saxons for the use of monasteries, particularly for the monastic schools, as a process of appropriation of Latin began certainly under Anglo-Saxon influence in the course of the 8th century. In the times of Charlemagne and his father Pippin, with vernacular clauses in Bible manuscripts, in monastic and spiritual texts, in other school literature. Purpose of the clauses was intelligere, the understanding of the Latin language, and moreover of the Latin and Christian heritage. But it should be noticed that the demanding works of Bible translation appear only in the times of the Carolingian reformers like Alcuin, an Anglo-Saxon, like Bishop Angelrim of Metz, Arch-Chaplain of the King, like Bishop Theodulf of Orleans, and so on. At the end of the 8th century and in the first decades of the 9th century, beginning with a stylistically skilled translation of Matthew's Gospel by the author of the translation of the so-called Isidore group, who in all probability worked in the regions of Lorraine near Metz, that means near one of the Carolingian capitals. In 794, at the Synod of Frankfurt, under the influence of Charlemagne and his reformers, the following guiding principle was proclaimed: Deus in omni lingua ad orator. God can be adorated in every language. The way was paved for translations of the Bible into the vernacular languages of the Carolingian Empire. It cannot be pure coincidence that circa 830, at the most famous monastery of Fulda east of the Rhine, during the abbotship of Alcuin's pupil Rabanus Maurus, a leading reformer of the second generation, the splendid translation of the Gospel Harmony of Tatian was achieved, confronting line for line the Latin and the Old High German Bible texts. The Gospel Harmony of the Syrian Tatian, 2nd century, had been transmitted into Latin by Victor of Capua in the 6th century. During his stay at Rome, the Anglo-Saxon reorganizer of the Frankish Church and founder of the monastery of Fulda, Winfried Bonifatius, acquired the manuscript of the Latin Tatian translation and gave it to his monastic foundation. This Fulda work, composed by a team of translators and scribes, was certainly dedicated to the learning of Latin and to a better understanding of God's holy message, all set in a monastery of town dimensions, a monastic city, a center of learning and spirituality, a production center of knowledge and books, especially Bible commentaries, the most of them written down by the aforementioned scholar and abbot Rabanus Maurus. At the same time, in the Germanic language-speaking parts of the Frankish Empire, north of the Alps, a fort, supported by the clerical reformers and their followers, began against the inherited, secular, mostly heroic poetry of the nobility. Alcuin, in the late 8th century, lashed out against the performance of a revenge song dealing with the deeds of the Danish hero Ingeld. Verbatim, that means the revenger in English monastery. Quid Ingeldus cum Christo? What has Ingeld to do with Christ? Asked Alcuin his monastic brothers. And in harmony with many admonitiones synodales and many capitula episcoporum of the 9th century, the priest, magister, and author of a Bible poem, Ottfried of Wissembourg or Weissenburg, fights in the 60s of the century against the sonus rerum inutilium, against the performance of useless stories, and contra the cantus obscenus of the laymen, offending the ears of pious men and women. Thus, it came to be repeated remarkable attempts of vernacular literarization of holy doctrines and stories in contact areas between clergy and laymen during the last decades of the Carolingian epoch. The existence and relevance of these contact areas depends on how common the abilities to write and to read were among laymen. In Italy, but hardly north of the Alps, we have quite a lot of original charters with personal signatures of laymen, rightly characterized as semi-literati. In the Saargau, east of Metz in Lorraine, in the first half of the 8th century, but not later on, lay notaries existed. In contrast, St. Gall charters show the increase of rural priest writers for the German southwest. At the end of the 9th century, but not earlier, we are informed, for instance, again at St. Gall, that the sons of the monastery's vassals should be educated in the Schola Laicorum. However, we know nothing about the success. During the last decades, it was Rosamond McKitterick who established the thesis of an expanded literacy of Carolingian laymen and lay women. Indeed, we know of pious nobles such as Count Rorico of Maine, of whom in recognition is said, "This venerable count, every day after the matutinal hymns, practiced holy contemplations in his chapel, beautiful established at his estate, according to aristocratic customs." Here, we can recognize the imitation of clerical and monastic devotion styles. In addition to that, we know of some high aristocrats as owners of libraries containing, among other, books, also religious ones. But these dukes, earls, and counts possessed clergymen and capillani in their household who ran the spiritual services and could read out religious works to their seigneur. Things look better for lay women, particularly in the higher nobility. The best, but perhaps exceptional example is given by the aforementioned Duoda, the wife of the Margrave Bernhard of Septimania and Barcelona, an important player at the Carolingian court. In the years of 840 to 843, she wrote a didactic manual for her sons, full of Christian mind and education, full of biblical citations. Further, women of noble rank are known to whom spiritual tracts and books have been dedicated. The Matrona Veneranda Judith, who pushed the aforementioned monk Ottfried of Wissemburg to write a poetic Frankish gospel harmony, could also have been a literata. But even in this case, we cannot be sure whether or not in the end her chaplain or priest had finally to read out the book to her. But we know that at the end of the 9th century, a woman personally read the Palatinus manuscript of Ottfried's work. The book itself spoke using a marginal clause, Kisila discona min filu las. That means, the noble Kisula read me often. Most of the testimonies for a certain literacy of the lay nobility are to be found in the west of the Frankish Empire, on the soil of the Gallo-Romagna. The testimonies thin out in the regions of the Rhineland and dry up on the right-hand border of the Rhine. But there have been other contact areas between the church and the laity, for instance, the cult of the saints. More demanding projects show us another specifically late Carolingian area of contact in the repeated attempt to transfer biblical and spiritual knowledge in poetic form to the layman. These projects are unthinkable without the model of the late antique Latin Bible poems of Arator, Avitus, Jovencus, and Sudulius, meanwhile being subject matter in the Carolingian schools. In extent and size, the vernacular Bible epics also emulate these models. Finally, the two most important works to be dealt with here in the next minutes are the most extensive poems of the Carolingian epoch. Latin poems included, leading for the so-called Heliant, that means Savior, with 5,000 and more alliterative verses, and for Ottfried's Liber Evangeliorum with 7,000 and more rhymed lines. The Old Saxon Gospel harmony of the Heliant is based on the Old High German Fulda translation of the aforementioned Tatian and was composed as instigation of a Ludovicus Peissimus Augustus, identified by some scholars with the Emperor Louis the Pious, in the 840, died in 840, by some others with his son Louis the German. This doesn't matter here. According to a Latin prefatio of the work, the ruler appointed a singer or poet, in Latin vates, not unknown to his compatriots. In the prefatio, the Heliant is classified as a part of the ruler's efforts to organize the Christian empire and the Christian religion, particularly to fulfill his duty of pastoral care concerning the souls of his subjects. Until today, the preface says, only the literati had knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, but now the Augustus began to spread the knowledge of the divine text to all people under his rule, speaking the lingua teurisca, that means the vernacular language of the Germanic peoples. The new poem in lingua germanica, that means in Old Saxon, is addressed to the illiterati, giving the holy lecture of God's laws and doctrines to them. Indeed, the Heliant, surviving in 6 mostly fragmentary manuscripts, is formally aimed at traditional Germanic poetry, especially heroic poetry with its alliterative verse form. Therefore, the addressing to the illiterate public is absolutely credible. In contrast, the Latin prefatio also contains advices for the keen lector, in Latin studiosus lector, and one of the manuscripts shows in the scene of the Annunciation of the Archangel Gabriel to Mary a musical notation. So we can't exclude the performance in monasteries, arranged perhaps in the context of lectures in monastic refectories, where indeed some brothers or sisters may not have understood the Latin language. It was certainly an important intention of the unknown author of the Heliant to adapt the materia of the Gospels to the style and to the forms of thinking of the inherited noble and heroic poetry. The adaptation certainly included the transformation of biblical structures and terminology into the features, patterns, and terms of the Germanic epos, and included some formulaic decor of the heroic songs, included also the breadth of the narration, full of variation, and finally included the adoption of the values of the noble public. For instance, conscience of one's station, loyalty of the vassals to the Lord, sense of power and control, finally ostentation and representation. Now let's see how the old Saxon poet embroiders, using the variation style of the heroic epos, the sober and short biblical verse, which introduces the murder of John the Baptist. And as his birthday came nearer, Herodes celebrated a banquet together with the princes, dukes, and nobles. See now handout number 1. First, I will read the last 4 lines in Old Saxon to give you a little impression, small impression of the language. Drog man vin an flet, skiri mit skalon, skenkion vurbun, gengon mit goldfat und gamman was da inne, glut an der Ruhala, helidos drunkun. Now the translation. Time had come for the King of the Jews in the course of the year, known by wise men and the people, the time of his birthday, the time when he first saw the light of day. It was an old custom of the nobles and the people to celebrate this day by a banquet. A big crowd of men came together in the guest hall, in the house of their army leader, in the house where the ruler sat on his royal throne. Many Jews came into the guest room. They were glad in their mind, and they came with a light heart. They saw that the donator of rings, their Lord, stayed in bliss. Purest wine was brought in bowls to the house. Waiters were busy, hurried with golden jugs. Pleasure grew. Men began to shout in the hall. The warriors drank. At many places, the atmosphere of the narrative aristocratic culture, the colors from the world of landed property, give archaic charms to the poems, standing in a strange contrast to the world of the Gospels. For example, the birth of Christ at Bethlehem is preceded by the order of the Emperor Augustus to survey his empire and to count the people. And this order is pronounced in Old Saxon as ban and boodskapis. It means by ban and commandment. The people concerned hurries to their ordil, that means to their original property, and to their handmahal, that means the sign of inheritance. They are wandering to the castles of their origin, where official scribes register in lists of census all the names, lands, and people. It goes without saying that the disciples of Jesus appear as followers of a certainly heavenly king. Like a hermit of Corinthian times, Christ, before his first public entrance, stays now in the desert, not in the desert, but in forest and jungle. Now I will pass over all the stuff of handout number 2 and begin with a passage of number 3. The Saxon Vates, author of the Heliant, also seizes the opportunity of the Gethsemane scenario for elaborating the martial assault of Petrus against the warrior Malchus in the style of heroic fights. The disciples, the followers, declares to the Savior, now hand out number 3 directly in translation. If it is your will and wish, my ruling lords, say the disciples, that they should spear us on the points of javelins, wounded by the weapons, then we would love to die here as followers for our Lord, pale in the body. But Simon Petrus, the bold third man, got angry. His mouth swelled. He could not speak a single word. His heart turned in bitterness while the enemies tried to tie up his Lord. Full of anger, the high-minded hero went forward to protect his ruler, to save bravely his Lord. His mind knew no swaying, his heart knew no fear. He drew his blade, he pulled off his sword, attacked the first of the enemies, using the strength of his hands. Malchus was marked by the sharpness of the blade, marked on the right side by the third. The ear was cut to pieces, sore was his head. The bloody cheek and the ear burst under a death blow. Blood jumped like oil, flushed out of the gash. The leader of the enemies had heart is sick. The warriors fell back, they shrinked from the bite of the third. But a Christian turn follows immediately. The Savior heals the wound and repeats his message. We are not allowed to be angry, not allowed to put up resistance against the fights of the enemies. Our deeds are not able to turn the things. Christ preaches the total negation of the heroic spirit. Now the heroic pose of Petrus appears in substantial vanity. Christ himself, therefore, was, to put it as Gottschalk, also a Saxon and pupil of Rabanus Maurus, abbot of Fulda, as Gottschalk says, Maximus Heros, the greatest of the spiritual warriors. On no accounts the features of the Hilliand, remembering style and values of the Germanic heroic songs, contain points of departure for a so-called Germanization of Christianity, which earlier scholars hoped to find. These features rather belong to the stratum of the actualization the author gave to his subject matter. Rightly, all that was explained by the praxis of missionary accommodation, that's the term of Johannes Rathofer, as an attempt to accept, so far as possible, the native concepts of the readers and listeners of the poem, in no case central in important Christian contexts, have been given up by the author. The author of the Hilliand was theologically well educated and familiar with the mainstreams of Carolingian theology. He emphasizes the divine nature of Jesus, the universal kinghood of Christ on earth and in heaven, in the style of a Carolingian Majestas Domini, representing the Lord, like in the most illustrated gospel manuscripts, as a cosmic ruler being enthroned on the globe. Christ is Kuningo Riciost, that means the mightiest of all kings. He is Helag Heaven Kuning, the holy and salvation-spending King of the heaven. It's no accident that the author only in one single place, when he tells the story of the blinds from Jericho, gives a detailed spiritual exegesis. The healing of the blinds. Spiritualita means the everlasting duty for missionary activities and catechetic instruction of the non-converted, which are caught in their caecitas mentis, in their mental blindness. Beside of the Hilliand exists a second Old Saxon Bible poem, also to date in the 40s or 50s of the 9th century, the so-called Old Saxon Genesis. Already in the year 1875, the eminent philologist Eduard Sievers had discovered a longer insertion in the Anglo-Saxon Genesis. He identified this passage as a translation from a lost Old Saxon poem called Genesis B. The later discovery of 3 fragments of an Old Saxon Genesis in a Vatican manuscript, together with Hilliand fragments, confirms his supposition. So we have altogether 920 lines of this poem. The Vatican Genesis parts deal with three biblical scenes. First, the rebellion and fall of Lucifer and his vessel angels, of his comitatus, including the revenge of Satan by seduction of the first human couple. Second, the story of Cain and Abel, the first murder of a near relative. Number three, the destruction of Sodom, the punishment of a sinner city. The author of the Genesis had a good knowledge of theological and legendary literature. For his narration, he used not only the canonical Bible, but also other sources, even apocryphal texts. Especially the devil stories are formulated in impressive independence. The stories of the Genesis are constantly regarded actual exemplar of human endangering, of human temptation by evil forces. The fall of Lucifer is caused by superbia, by pride and arrogance. The fall of Adam and Eve by the thought of insight in the fallible nature of creatures. The subjects of the old Saxon scenes are disobedience and arrogance, and they serve for the actualization of the work. After the conquest of Saxony by the Franks at the end of the 8th century, for the upper class of the Saxons, the problems of faithfulness and fidelity, of obedience and subordination, virulent in a world of lords and vassals, had become a social significance. In the poems, the vassalitic terminology becomes an instrument of actual interpretation of the old stories of the human origins. Abraham and Lot, the only just men of Sodom, appear as shining examples of right behavior facing the feudal lord, while Lucifer personifies the noble potence caught without chains of salvation in his superbia. He designates the powerful man who slips off his commitments given by God. He tries to push the legitimate ruler from the throne, collecting himself an army of followers. Lucifer says, "Why should I take pain with the established order? I do not need any lord. I have power enough to build a higher and better throne in heaven. Why should I be a servant, paying homage to him? Why should I bow my head as a vassal? I can be God like him. Strong fighters and comrades will help me. They will not leave me alone in the battle. Those warriors have a firm heart. The noble men elected me as ruler," and so on. After the fall of the rebellious angels, after the punition of Satan, the author of the Old Saxon Genesis gives a topical command. This is the destiny of every man who fights against his ruler, in outrage against his noble Lord. And now let's start for taking notice of the Gospel of the Franks. Between 863 and 871, in the Carolingian Empire, the birth of a second Gospel harmony in lingua theodisca, in the language of a Germanic people, took place. This time not on the base of Tatian, but elaborated in an independent auctorial selection from the four Gospels and full of exegetic reflections. The author of this Liber Evangeliorum was Ottfried of Wissembourg, priest, magister, writer, notarius, and also composer of a gospel commentary, but particularly pupil of the famous Rabanus Maurus, abbot of the monastery of Fulda, later on Archbishop of Mainz, and therefore heir of the Carolingian reformers. He dedicated the first chapter of his voluminous work of 5 books and 140 capitula to the question, Cur scriptur hunc librum theodisque dictavarit? Ottfried gave in Frankish language the answer with another question. In Frankish, Vananas culun francon und das bivancun, nisi in Frankis kon beginnen, sie Gottes Lob singen. Why should the Franks be the only ones unable to begin in Frankish singing God's praises. The Franks, according to Ottfried and to the historian of the 7th century called Fredegar, derive from the ancient noble lineage of the great Alexander. Therefore, in courage, in economic power, in piety, they are equal to the Romans descending from the Trojani. It is absolutely justified that the story of Christ, of the new hero of the Franks, will be written down in Frankisch Katzunga, in Frankish language. The Liber Evangeliorum deliberately claims to be a Frankish poem, a gospel for the Eastern Regnum Francorum, the Osterreichi, ruled by Charlemagne's grandson Louis the German. Ottfried's work is strictly embedded in the court circles of this king. For the king, Ludovic der Snello, des vis Durmes Follo, that means Louis the Brave, full of wisdom, he wrote the book. To the king, he dedicated it. From the king, he expected support for the further publication and distribution of his work. At the same time, Ottfried dedicated his gospel harmony with a letter explaining in detail the purposes and the structure of the project to the Archbishop Leudbert of Mainz, former monk of the Reichenau, now influential statesman of the Eastern Reign, and this 870 incoming Archicapellanus and Archicancellarius of the king. Further on, he dedicated the vernacular poem to Bishop Salomo I of Constance, his former teacher, another statesman, also influential in the entourage of Louis the German. Abbot of Ottfried's monastery Wissembourg was Grimald, who certainly had to give the permission to the big project. Before Liudbert, it was him, Grimald, meanwhile also Abbot of St. Gall in Switzerland, who was Arch-Chancellor and Arch-Chaplain of the king. A fourth exemplar of the work Ottfried addressed to the leading monks of St. Gall, to the Pro-Abbas Hartmut, and to the Magister Werinbert. In his Latin letter to Liudbert, Ottfried explicitly has integrated himself in the poetic and formal tradition of the late antique Bible poems. He cites Juvencus aratur prudentius ceterique multi. His intention is, as he says, to push back, we mentioned it at the beginning of this lesson, the ludus secularium vocum, of the secular poems of the layman. He wrote his book in Frankish to encourage those who are frightened by the foreign Latin language. They should learn, that's a citation, learn to know the most holy words in their own language and to understand the laws and doctrines of God in the mother tongue. In the programmatic first chapter of his work, why the author wrote the book in the Theodisk language, he repeats that in Frankisch Katzunga, in the Frankish language. Ottfried's gospel poem was postulated by fratres, that means monastic friends, and by an unknown matrona named Judith, perhaps belonging to the noble family of the Unruachings, as daughter of Margraf Eberhard of Friuli and granddaughter of Emperor Louis the Pious and his wife Judith. In addition to this, the manuscript tradition, remarkable with 8 exemplars, we can reconstruct, 4 of them survived. The tradition leads in both directions to clerical and laical addresses. The Freising manuscript of the early 10th century, ordered by Bishop Waldo, a relative of the aforementioned Bishop Salomo of Constance, seems to be used for inner monastic lectures. At Fulda, the Liber Evangeliorum was fully copied still around 975. On the other side, the Codex Palatinus 52 was in possession of an Alemannic noble family, the Burkhardings, which holds the ducal dignity of Suabia for some decades. A list of donations to churches in possession or in tutela of this family confirms this supposition. In the Palatinus, Ottfried's lyrical annunciation of the angel to St. Mary is annotated with Neume for musical performance. A female reader, we mentioned it, that she feels intensely read the book, but the advices and comments fixed by Ottfried on the margins of his text, and also the intratextual appeals to read the biblical sources and to consult commentaries speak in favor of other readers knowing Latin. As we have already seen with the Old Saxon Heliand, we have to be aware again of an intended multifunctional use of the work. Ottfried organized the content of the four Gospels in 5 books analogous to the 5 human senses. The holy content should transform the inequalitas, the imperfection of the human sensuality, into the sancta quadrata equalitas, the square perfection and divine beauty of the four. The theologian of Wissembourg elaborated a theological modern structure. Rhetorically well-founded, he followed an ordo artificialis, combining the synoptic gospels with the accentuation of Christ's humanity, with the Gospel of John, who stressed the divine nature of Christ as incarnation of the eternal Logos. The first book guides us from the Annunciation of the angel to Mary, from the birth at Bethlehem, to the baptism of Christ by the precursor John, where the Son of God is confirmed by a heavenly voice. The second book has its new and genuine point of departure in the prologue of the Gospel of John, where the divine Logos is revealed as the lux, the light of man. Christ unveils himself by preaching and signs as a divine teacher and thaumaturgus. The third book conjures the miraculous power which until today works in the world. Vio die selber heili nu ist wordi gemein. That means how this power of healing now is distributed over the whole world. Book 4 consequently contains the passion of the Savior, who takes upon his shoulders the sins of the world and releases the mankind by his cruel self-sacrifice. The 5th and last book tells the regressus Christi ad Deum, the return of Christ to God. That means the resurrection, the last instructions of the apostles, including the commandment for universal mission and conversion, and finally, the ascension of God's Son in Frankish, Uber himmila alle, uber sunnun liost, joch allun desan voroltiot, above all heavens, about the light of the sun and all people of the world. Ottfried ends his narration of salvation, transgressing his biblical model and following in a Christian concept of history with a description of the day of the last judgment and a painting of the equalitas, of the beauty and of the well-balanced structure of the heavenly kingdom, of the civitas Dei, then ruled by Christ, the cosmic Pantocrator, a kingdom which he confronts expressly with the inequalitas, with the ugliness and inconsistencies of earthly states. Comparable to the old Saxon Heliand, the aristocratic design of the main characters of the Bible poem cannot be overlooked. Especially the narration of the Annunciation gives an example, beginning with a cosmic scenario. God's messenger, Gabriel Angelus, travels to Mary. Flog sunnunpat, stero nostrasa, vega volcono sideroitis frono. He flew the path of the sun, the street of the stars, the way of the clouds, to this venerable lady. At the same time, this scene is a counterpart of the just mentioned Ascensio Domini. The coming Mother of Christ welcomes the angel in an aristocratic manner, postulated by her royal descent. In their palace, singing the psalter and weaving precious clothes. Ottfried models the speech of the angel to the Virgin as a promulgatio, as a kingly publication of the future events. He says much more than the Bible told. Mary shall not only carry God's Son, the creator of the world, but also the world König, the king of the world, the real heir of King David, who at the same time opens his own reign, the empire of the heavens to man. His throne, a citation, stays in heaven. There will be no king on earth who does not serve him, who does not honor him, giving in proskynesis precious gifts. Telling the birth of the Savior during the rule of Augustus, the Kaiser von Arumu, the Emperor of Rome, Ottfried contracts and concentrates the initial worldwide scenario in masterly production to the small room of the Incarnation at Bethlehem, finally developing at Carolingian times, unique hymn to the Virgin, a most tender connection between mother and child. See now, handout number 4. In translation, heal to the breast which Christ kissed over and over again. Heal to the mother who all the time spoke to him in silence. Heal to her who petted him and set him on her lap, who friendly swung him and laid him on her side. Blessed shall be who dressed and equipped him. Blessed shall be who is now in bed with such a child. Blessed shall be who warmed him, who embraced his arms and hands when the frost came to harm him. No man on earth can really sing enough her praises. No admirer is fully able to appreciate her goodness, but her sublime Son glorifies her. Her fame reaches so wide you can't measure it. She is really mother, but at the same time real virgin. Unharmed and in perfection, she gave birth to the heavenly Lord. This hymn, rhetorically formulated and using the expressive mellowness of nursery verse, certainly was, like a devotion picture, destinated to meditation and worship. Ottfried, in general, is a representative and what I will call linguistic theology, Sprachtheologie. Beside of 108 narrative chapters, 77%, his work contains also 24 exegetic chapters, 17%, headed Mystice, Moralita, Spiritualita. Beyond that, 8 legitimizing and explaining chapters, 6%, titled Prefatio, Conclusio, Ammonitio, Invocatio, Oratio, and so on. Not to count the many passages where in the narration biblical persons comment the events themselves. To comment, to explain, and to interpret the narration is the main intention of Ottfried. He understands himself as the instrument of the transformation of the word into healing and holy sense, as a humble tool for the revival of the dead letters to spirit, of the uncovering of the veiled, for the destruction of the shadows by the light of knowledge. Signs and miracles are pictorial, figurative doctrine needing exegesis. Also the sense won by interpretation is part of the Logos, revealed to the blind as light in a world of darkness. I will end my lesson with an absolutely small pragmatic comparison of the two big Carolingian poetic gospel harmonies in vernacular languages. The Saxon Heliant has 5,983 lines. The Frankish Liber Evangelium gives us a little bit more. It just said 7,104 lines. Both the Old Saxon and the Frankish Gospel harmony of Ottfried had success. We know of 6 and 8 manuscripts. But finally, we have to notice that the genesis of these vernacular theological top quality products cannot be imagined without the bonds to the Carolingian kings. Parallel son to the beginnings of vernacular pastoral literature during the times of Charlemagne, and a little bit later sprouting out under his son Louis the Pious and his grandson Louis the German. Grazie per la pazienza.
Thank you very much for your patience.
Bene, grazie per questa ricca presentazione, piena di accenti.
Thank you very much for this rich speech. with so many interesting inputs. Now, let's move to the debate or discussion on the three speeches of the afternoon. Are they coming all together? I guess no. So let's start with our first speech and speaker. Please, Professor Cutino. Questions? Yes. I see a couple of hands raised. Francesco Lubian, Padua. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Cutino for his speech, which was really interesting, especially the Pentateuch on this poem we are working on together. I wonder, well, could you tell us a bit more on the topic of the light and its physical and symbolic connotations? I was thinking of some verses of the book of the Numbers when we talk about the sight of God. I don't know if this is in the view of what you were saying. And then the representation of Eve also was interesting to me. I was wondering whether or not in these rewriting the Mitis Paucibus could not be part of it, maybe, because I took a look at the comments of Schluber, and here we know that this was useful for the Repletis. I don't know if there are some references to the honey from the mouth of the woman or some other meanings. Generally speaking, I think that there is a complexity, as you were saying, of literal and grammatical paraphrases instead of some interpretation inputs also or insights. Yes, thank you, Francesco, for these questions. Well, first of all, as for the light, well, I agree, completely agree. We should analyze it much better. Recently, I dealt with the Exodus in various contributions and papers. We know that we have epiphanies, several epiphanies in the Exodus, such as the Rovetordet, and I was astonished by that. I collected this documentation. I had to make a summary, otherwise it would have been too much material. When we have the Epiphany at the side of Moses removing his gaze because there's too much light, which is God, there's this equivalence, light, God, and the text states, Lumenque caligat, lumine deni mio, dominum quia cernere non est fas. That is, it is not possible to see God, so the eye, caligat, it is a sort of spiritual collision. Well, God is light, and if you look at him, you become blind in the real term. And then there's another interesting thing in the dialogue between Moses and God. Moses tries to move away from this task. And as you will remember, he says, I'm the one who let us people be blind and speechless. And this is in a positive sense, actually, but it makes a distinction, which is very important. He says, I'm the one who tempora qui resetas surdis, qui rumina cecis, to give sight to the blind people. And then he adds, and this is completely free, videm dunque naciem pura de luce serenat. Those who already see. So giving pure light to those who already see. So this is a difference, giving the sight to the blind and giving a complete uh, vision to people who already have it. So the topic of the light is important. I agree. The second element on Eve is really interesting. Beyond the moglia corta, probably you also noticed that we have the nivea dent in it. So from one bite to the sweet fruits with with the teeth, her teeth. When we take a look at the niveus, this characterizes 3 cases out of 4, if I'm not wrong, only for women. Rebecca, for instance, the female beauty. Only one case is the Niveus annus of Abele, but in all the other cases, there are female protagonists, exclusively female. So if you put them together, the Eniviodente, the Melitibus Falcius, and I agree with you, well, I cannot see these metonymy. So it is something that has to do with this characterization as something that is potentially weak, infirma, therefore subject to the influx of it. There was another hand raised, maybe? Well, actually, it's just a curiosity. I have a question for Michele Cutino, but also for Francesco Lubiam, who is involved in this task. My impression, starting from the reading you gave us, is that the poet of the Heptateuch takes some freedom and builds also with a detachment from the Bible, a continuous narrative which not necessarily coincides with it. You're working on it. So is this an episode or is this a tendency? Because in the second case, well, this is a great critical news. Well, allow me to give an answer and then Francesco will speak after me. This is not by chance and it is not rare. I can cite, for example, dealing with the sacrifice of Abraham. You will remember this episode. So Abraham has to divide into the veal, the sheep, and so on. And he multiplies the animals, not just sheep, veals, horses. He also gives a list of animals belonging to the ritual Jewish sacrifices, and then he treats them in the Deuteronomian, where the sacrifice of Abraham is a sort of necessary sacrifice of what the sacrifices will be in the Greek word. So narrative, liberty or freedom, well, there's so many of them. And I would say that in Exodus also, we have some significant types of freedom. So this is why I wanted to highlight this topic, because normally we say that pseudo Cyprian is much more um, related to the biblical text and respectful. However, they are quite original, and I believe that the text of the Old Testament was giving freedom to the poets, and the New Testament cannot do it. If we look at Sedulius, Juvencus, well, here we cannot modify a story that cannot be modified. The news is not in terms of in the diegetic plan, but rather the exegetic plan. In this case, you can say something new, but not in some other terms. Instead, in the Old Testament, we can notice that. Thank you. When you mentioned the light, the clothing of Adam and Eve, there's an observation that we should make, more than one maybe. First of all, these topics were already dealt with in the exegesis, Chrysostom, but especially Ephraim, in the topic on clothes in each and every writing of him. I'd like to recall that when we depict the Bible, we do an exegesis of the text. For example, the story of the light clothes is translated in some thin tunics worn by Adam and Eve before the sin. And then they will have them, they will wear them after the sin. And the person having the baptism will gain this light after baptism. And this is the parable that we have. I would like to highlight, however, probably you won't do it, but it happens sometimes when you use images, you think that these are like some stickers for improving, enhancing the writings. Probably you should see that in the Western tradition, from the Carolingian era to the Roman era, there are two different types of interpretation. We have the garments or clothes of Adam and Eve, which were annual clothes, or they did not exist. Are they naked when they are eliminated, so to say, when they are away from the heaven? And the last comment you gave for granted that in the sin, Eve has a discussion with the devil and then gives the fruit to Adam, and they commit a sin. But I can tell you that this is not something that we should take for granted, that Eva ate the fruit, because there are two versions, Ephagon and Ephagen, so that only Adam ate the fruit. Thank you very much for these comments. And actually, this is not just about these two texts, but rather some interesting elements, autonomous compared with these two that I presented in my speech. First of all, the topic of the clothes. What you said has to do with these, but not the topic of the light corresponding with the clothes. The two topics are put together by the poet in a consistent storytelling. So they see, they have a full knowledge. However, what they see is that they're naked. It is like a sort of counterpoint or counterbalance. But in this text, we do not mention it. The question of the clothes is interesting. Were they naked or not? Well, actually, in some poetical scriptures in the Genesis, the two protagonists, not in paraphrases, I'm referring to some other autonomous texts, Christian poetry, and then references to the biblical text, but not actually biblical poetry. Sometimes they are introduced as not naked, so wearing clothes such as sheep clothes, or maybe in their silk, silky clothes, so full of bristles in this monastic context. And the condition of John the Baptist was linked to this condition where people were just wearing some raw clothes. From this point of view, we do not know what happened, whether or not they were naked or they were wearing some clothes. I cannot underestimate the iconographic value of this text. We dedicated a conference, me and Francesco Stella, to this topic, and it will be published soon in the Millennium Studies. Antonella Ghidioni from Rome. Should I go? Quickly. I'm not specialized in poetry, not even from the late antiquity, but I would like to go back to the text that you mentioned and about the lock, because these texts date back to the 5th century. What about the first manuscripts emerging? What about their copy? What emerges from it? Well, as for the Heptateuchos, the manuscript tradition is quite little, I would say. However, we have it. We have two manuscripts from Laon, coming from the Carolingian area. They're not complete because for the Exodus, for instance, we just have one of them. And then there's a Cambridge Code a bit later in the 10th century with all the poems in the Heptateuch, but it's quite incomplete. And the circulation also for the indirect tradition seems to be British or French, because already in the 7th century there are some quotations, indirect quotations of these poets. As for Mario Vittorio, yes, we have a codex, which is unique, the Parisinus Latinus, coming from the Carolingian era as well. It is a very interesting manuscript because it has some unica. So probably this was done by somebody having some precise intentions. For example, in the Laus Ioannis, we have it only there, and then we have another Carolingian manuscript that had to be related to this. I just wanted to say that these two poets actually did not belong to the curriculum, so to say, so they are not widespread in the 12th or 13th century. Yeah, but I would like to say something about it and add something to it, because the poet in the Pentateuch is mentioned in grammatical examples. Yes, but when we talk about diffusion, Sedulius, and the others, it's a completely different thing. Well, for sure, they do not belong to a canon because it was done, but they were not there. There's no doubt on it. And moreover, we know that, but we cannot talk of fortune. For the poet of the Heptateuch, there are some grammar experts who quote that. So, from a school point of view, educational point of view, we can imagine that. So, briefly, I would like to thank Michele Cutino for his speech and for what he's doing for promoting this text that was a bit underestimated from several points of view, including the hermeneutic rate. I'm not saying exegesis, but hermeneutics of the storytelling beyond the limit of the Bible. My questions for you are a personal curiosity, first of all, on the passage from Lignum or Maurus Maurum in the poetic tradition, but also patristic tradition. In the second case, you chose a specific cut for these, a specific layout for your paper, but you know the overview of the late antiquity. So I have a question, and my question is the audience in these things, not the poems from Juvencus, Sedulius, having an ideological reason. These important poems, but that are not that widespread. How do we justify such a great effort as the one in the Pentateuch without an audience? And what's the kind of audience you can imagine? Well, this second question is very intriguing. As for Ethiad, we have the chance to know the intentions of the author. The author is saying, and of course, we have to be really careful. But he says that you will address his text to students, to young people, because he talks about puelibus annis. So there's a specific recipient, and Gennario, in his statement, says that this work was dedicated for the death of Abraham. We only have a poem until the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then we do not know whether or not this was complete or incomplete. However, this news is interesting because it confirms that this work was dedicated to his son. So, from this point of view, there's a sort of didascalic direction that seems to be quite clear because this is a didascalic poem, and I think that its ambition is to be a Christian poetical text that can give important um, inputs from a narrative point of view, and also from the point of view of cultural analysis of the story. He deals with the birth of the arts, the progress, the moral decay of morality. So, something that he introduces and presents in these type of text. So, for Aretia, we have these two levels of interpretation because we know that there's an official destination. However, we also have some other purposes. That is uh, speaking of the deep and theological meaning of this story, because there are some clear allusions to these topics, grace and some other topics, having a didascalic value, but also the function of addressing a high and educated audience. As for the Heptateuch, I know that there's the necessity and the will to use an encyclopedical version of the text using verses equivalent to the Evangelium Libri in Iovenco, because this was done for the Old Testament and there isn't something including it. So the first attempt is to put this story in verses. Then second, the categories of the storytelling of the classical poetry. There are no didascalic intentions. There's a narrative intention. This does not mean that we do not have some other meanings. For a Christian, this always has a meaning. And then there are some assessments, evaluations which emerge. So these narrative aspects is important. When we think of a school context, I'm not sure, not completely, because he wanted to have some ambitions and also the ambition to propose a sort of complete poem for reproposing through the classical method these aspects. And this is the first goal. The fundamental criterion is resemblance. And this is why I do not agree with this blindness. When we have Vittorio separating these two texts, sometimes he puts them together because he's interested in the consistency of the two texts. So Eve had to be created before. So there's a narrative consistency. That's the main purpose. The biblical text, respected as it is, for Vittorio, we have a deep meaning, but we have to tell it the way it is.
Direi che eh,
Well, I don't know if we have enough time to take another question. I kindly ask you to be brief both when asking your question and when answering the question. I'm Silvia Mangiadoni. I come from the University of Rome La Sapienza. With regard to the diffusion of Heptateuch, I'd like to ask you how much we know about the spread of it, especially in Great Britain. You mentioned some grammarists mentioning it, and I'm asking it, Aldelmo, making reference to deity by telling um, that they are godly creatures, but when they mention the wood of a wood hanging from a tree that represents the tree of life, that's another important hint. So I'd like to ask you, how much can we understand on the basis of it about the spread of Heptateuch in this field? Yes, well, if we look at intertextuality, especially from the point of view of poems, Heptateuch had a certain popularity. However, the issues that of understanding dependency relations, because there are some echoes of Heptateuchs, echoing in Sedulio, Narito, in Mario Vittorio. So poets from the 5th century have a complex intertextuality, which is also a mutual one. This is something we should delve into. It is about an immediate and subsequent knowledge. Adelmo, Adelhelm, is mentioned continuously, and it looks like Adelhelm was well known in a British context, thanks to Alcuin. I've tried to be brief. Well, let's move on to the second lesson. Dinkovabrunn and Haubrix. Sorry, it's just Dinkovabrunn. Are there any questions?
Thank you for your very stimulating paper. And I have three questions or comments. You didn't mention, the first one is you didn't mention the tituli of manuscript illuminations, the Carolingian period, which are very extensive biblical poetry or revisions, whatever term. I'm thinking especially of a manuscript I worked on, the first Bible of Charles the Bald, which has 316 lines of poems, and a third of them may be biblical. The second is Fulcoius, and I would add then Baudry of Bourgogne, his later successor, somewhat later, whose poems are also, biblical poems are also very pictorial. Fulcoius, I think, was involved in writing captions. And then finally, your wonderful point, interesting point about Leonine hexameters, which become almost the rule in early 12th century picture tituli. So I wonder if you can
Okay,
help me with this.
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. Of course, I know about the Carolingian tituli, but things had to be sort of contained a little bit. And there is Francesco Stella, whose book on the biblical poetry in the Carolingian period covers all of this. So I really skimmed over because just there was no time to cover everything. I will make sure to add this in the final written version. Yes, I agree completely with you that Fulcoius is extremely visual. And I'm very happy that you are bringing to light the 11th century poets, because I repeat, they are extremely interesting and deserve a lot of attention from all sorts of different points of view. You would be very interested in the forthcoming volume on Versus ad Picturas, because there are many of these points were covered and expounded, and yes. But thank you for pointing out that I should stress a little bit more the titular production in the Carolingian period, which. What about Baudry? Yes, we will see. We will see what comes out. Yeah. Also, Francesco said, "Oh no, you should have talked more about the 11th century." But I said, "But you gave me 5 centuries. How could I?" If you can given me the 11th century, all of these would have been covered. But 5 centuries, that's all I could do in 45 minutes.
Un altro intervento?
Pietro Fusco.
Any other questions? Pietro Fusco from Strasbourg. I'm going to speak in Italian. I've been working on the hexameral tradition, and I've noticed that a few of the poems that have been mentioned are about the creation. the story of creation, especially when it comes to the first phase you delved into. So I'm wondering about the goal of dealing with the first book of Genesis. Is it by contrast with the pagan signs? Well, the first book of the Bible is a firm point, is a starting point. Even though you don't do anything else as a poet, the first book of Genesis has to be put into a context of the Bible, of in the a broader context of the Bible, with the Hexameron too. Indeed, every type of treatment that could be performed is done with the Genesis. The same is not applied to all the books of the Bible. If we had to do a study on how to treat poetry, poems during a poem from the early Middle Ages referring to the Genesis, that's going to be an awful lot of work because the Genesis is present in all type of context. Good afternoon, Martina Paccara from the University of Siena. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I have a question. Well, the dialogical form of the nuptials is something that could be found again in the 12th or 13th poems, or in your group classifications. I mean, would you include it within the full-scale biblical paraphrases, or will this sorting apply only to 11th and 12th century, and so it wouldn't fall into this scope? Well, this is a classification I created for the 11th and the 12th century because this is the period I am devoting to. However, we should call these late antiquity poems as epical poems. However, they are not epical as such, and that's why I don't call it as epical poems, epic poetry. It is also difficult from the point of view of summing it up. So I leave it to somebody else. When it comes to the 12th and the 13th century, I think we should call it secondary paraphrases, or we should look for another term to define that type of poetry. Well, when it comes to dialogue, it is not a unicum for Koyos. However, this type of dialogue among different biblical characters is an element that could be found in the Carmina. That is to say, when you have a poem which is about a specific reason, you can find smaller scale dialogues. However, when it comes to full scale, you don't find these type of dialogues so frequently. No translation available. Both.
Oh, no, mi dispiace, Adam. Per I don't know if what Michele just said is something that I can share, which, according to which we do not touch upon the story of the New Testament, while the story of the Old Testament is much more developed. Well, it is within poetry. After the period I've talked about today, we see that much more elements add up.
Therefore, there is no fear to change Jesus' life. Well, he does things, then there are people coming asking what's going on, why is it going this way? So we are witnessing a type of weird freedom. How can they do these things? Well, however, it is not like in late antiquity. These things have changed. The clothes. Okay, let's focus on the next question.
Very clear and informative talk. I have a few very short questions, and perhaps we can do this antiphonally. The first is idle curiosity. The poems of Hermoldus Nigellus, do they have biblical overtones, citations? Do you happen to know?
Okay, let's be honest. Everything has some kind of Bible in it. How do we define how much Bible do we need to have in a work in order to call it biblical poetry in the way we talk about it? So no, I don't think so. I wouldn't include him because there isn't enough Bible there. Because everything, to some degree, goes back to the Bible. So Nigellus, no.
Great.
Okay, if you want him, okay, maybe I can do it. No.
That was really idle curiosity. More important, based on the information you gave us, one of the things we could see is that the 10th century poets, even though there are only two of them, they wrote much more than the 11th century followers, but you didn't give us the lengths of the Carolingians. So how did the 10th century compare in terms of length to the Carolingian predecessors? And do we give the 10th century folks any credit for writing a lot, or is it just a lot more and it's not interesting at all?
So first of all, I thought that I sort of made it sort of clear, maybe not so clear, that the Carolingian poets write a lot, but don't write long biblical poems. They don't. They just don't. They don't. I mean, if you accept my three groups, that this epic narrative, the epics of the Carolingian period are all hagiographical. They start writing the life of this saint and the life of that saint, and these are long, involved, all of this. But they are not really Bibles. They are not Bible in verses. So there is a huge production in the Carolingian period, but in the field of biblical poetry, no long poems, not even short narrative poems. So somehow there is a great shift of, okay, no, this is done. There is a canon from late antiquity. We will continue reading, especially Sedulius, Arator, okay, and we are not going to write that. And then, write rhythmical poetry like crazy, and then in comparison with the 10th century, yes, there are these two people. Especially the Occupatio. I suggested to all of you to read the Cena Cipriani. I don't encourage you to read the Occupatio. It is, oh my God, especially book one. Yeah, it is very painful. I always thought that, okay, sure, of course, that text would never have any afterlife, because who would read this? It is really very difficult, incomprehensible, and very, but okay, it's long, it is true. So in this respect, I mean, I don't like me saying this, because I've always tried to tell my students that we are not here to judge. We are not here to judge. Maybe we think this is horrible, but it is not our place to judge. We should just read. And what was important to them, we are not here, we are not doing medieval studies to find ourselves. We are doing medieval studies to really find what was important and interesting to them. But I don't think that this Occupatio had any purchase, even in the Middle Ages. And I really cannot find any evidence of anybody knowing. And I think that this Abbot of Cluny just sat in his cell and said, "Oh, I'm going to write this occupatio now." Why did he call it occupatio even? Okay. So I don't know whether this answers your question.
Greti, una brevissima richiesta di informazione.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm not gonna praise you too much. Why not? Because many people before me praised your presentation. So my question is about the use of the written version to tell something more about the last part, which is very interesting. And I know Roberto is gonna hate me, but the more you write on this part, the better. Well, I have two. I'd like to ask you a question about the text you mentioned, the paraphrases of Psalms and the commentary to Psalms in the 12,000 verses, if it's not a mistake of the handout. Well, that's extremely interesting, and that's why this idea has come to my mind. Well, what do we have to use verses for a text that is already a poem? No, they're not manuscripts. This one from Tours is only one manuscript. We know it. Perhaps there are more, and we don't know them yet. Well, not completely. They are bits. However, I can tell you that these verses are long, but they do not cover the full book of Psalms. It's a field where you have to embark in a serious work, a serious study. When I started studying biblical poetry, I would say all the time, Psalms are not here. I can't see the Psalms in these works. And that's because within these full-scale Bibles, we don't have Psalms. These full-scale Bibles are about 1,000. However, we can't see the Psalms. And that's why I used to say that Psalms were not that important. I would think that they would not be there, that these these texts were making reference to the Bible only. But now that I've found these new elements, I think that we should review our assumptions, and with that we should review the role of versification and this whole activity of versifying. Why should a poet put psalms in poetry, in verses? When I see, I mean, I know it's an idea. You can transform the Holy Scripture into poetry with intertextual references, with images. And this may sound a bit too easy as an explanation. However, it's a plausible one. Well, and if there are any students here who would like to work on these psalms, please tell me. Good afternoon. I'm Maria Desideria Frezza, and I've been studying Byzantine and Middle Age art. I have a few questions about the Trolloninian study, and I'm asking it because since I'm an art history student, yeah, here we go. I find it all the time. It's not about Saint Clement, and it's not about the other poet you mentioned before. And I'm saying so because in Torcello there are less descriptions with a very wise taste, and that's why I'd like to ask you the story of these meter, and I would like to ask you what are the stories inspiring this type of work, this type of captions. Well, it would be another presentation, the Leonini studies, and that's because they say there was a poet and a musician in Paris and he would made up these verses, but that's not true. That's not true, because the Leoninian verses are were written earlier. Therefore, I do not believe that medieval poets are so prone to rhythmic poetry. However, they really liked rhymes. However, you should not think that after the arrival of Leoninians, they would all write like that. We have big poems where the normal hexameter is used, but that was the preferred meter for captions and for the titles of the images of Leo the XII. No, there are some of them that have no rhymes. It's a type of verses that they really liked. It's not something that can be used by everybody. Well, thank you very much once again to Dinkova Brun. And now we're going to leave the floor to the last group of questions for Professor Haubrich. Please. Are there any questions?
In your paper, you mentioned a marginal note, if I understand, musical note, alongside of the passage about the Annunciation. Could you talk a little more about that? What the music, what the note indicates? Is it a Neum or is it?
Neumann.
It's in
German Neumann.
Yes.
So
So
it's Neumann. There are Neumann in the Ottfried manuscript corrected by him. It's a Palatinus 52, also 52. And for the Helian tradition, there is the Codex Monacensis Orgy, coming out after the dictation of and localization by the most famous Bernhard Bischoff at Corvey, circa 850.
So at the beginning of the history of Neumes, of the notation, so Susan Boynton
I'm
is
no
somewhere.
specialist for these music things.
But what's interesting, or what comes to my mind, is the long history that the angel is singing. The angel's Ave Maria is the origin of singing.
Yes, that may be a connection between these two
So
things.
that, I mean,
between the music and
the Schubert being the greatest example, but you have it here already, and I can't think of an earlier example.
And this Capitulum di Ottfried, breathing of the Annunciation, is a very beautiful chapter with alliterative verses and rhymes together.
Beautiful.
Perhaps this was intended to sing it.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah.
Ci sono altre domande? Se
Okay, I think there are no more questions. So now we can move on to the presentation of the CISM Open Access Portal. I moderate the presentation as well. A couple of words. It will be very brief because we wanted to promote something that already President Menestoa detected and highlighted in the presentation of the week. Since October 2024, there's an online platform for hosting materials of some papers of our Fondazione. Enrico Menesto has enhanced the commitment of the scientific committee and the board of this foundation, this Fondazione, and this is something we have to do. Today, Fondazione CISAM is a private right foundation and a consistent part of the financing, public financing. And this is shown by the fact that CISAM is monitored by two ministries, the Ministry for Culture and the one for Education. So this passage was chosen in a mandatory way, I would say. There's a physiognomy of production, the production of the CISAM, that deserved promotion and an opening from the point of view of the access. From this point of view, CISAM joined some international guidelines, such as the strategic goal of European Union declared in 2016 for the creation of a new European open science cloud, and the fact that the UNESCO has promoted an open science for accelerating the path through the global goals of the European Union. And then in 2022, the Ministry for Research and Education published in the Open Science Plan an act precisely on this. So CISAM is joining this plan for research infrastructures through this platform, joining this national program for institutes of research. This is under an international profile. And of course, we want to have this integration, the integration of a catalog of the Fondazione CISAM on the Middle Ages, not just early Middle Ages. It is a rich catalog having more than 70 years of history. Now we have, at the moment, materials linked to the three main magazines of the Fondazione CISAM. And we have an embargo for the last 2 years. And also an online magazine, Amiche Rome, second edition now, a high quality magazine, or hopefully it will soon be a scientific magazine. And I'm very happy to leave the floor to the person who materially and created this platform. Enrico Falchi from Alligator allowed us to take the steps towards the digital system. I'm happy to have him here so that he can show us how to use this platform. You have the floor. So briefly, do not raise questions, ask questions on the Middle Ages. I'm not prepared, not at all. Because we do something where we know so many things, but not all of them. And that's the beautiful part of our job, I would say. We welcomed enthusiastically this project because it seems to us that it was a well studied adventure, and also it is well located uh, in a temporary field, because having online material will be more important than ever, because then the artificial intelligence draws everything from the websites and from these sort of data. So this is why we wanted to have these timely scanning, I would say. We picked the right period for it. So how to face this challenge? We wanted to transform our paper traditional database into something digital, open to everybody. And this is the image that we wanted and that we chose to represent the book that we live through, and then this becomes a device that you all know. First thing I'd like to present is the concept of the logo. We chose a butterfly. Why? Because the book is a symbol of knowledge, and with this project that was not studied by us, but it was studied and created by Chisholm, becomes accessible, flies as a butterfly in a certain way. Yes, it's a book becoming a butterfly. This is the logo that we picked for the project. How does it work? It's quite simple. Everybody can join it and reach it. Do we have internet? The internet connection. Okay, let's explain that and then we will see. We join the website through an URL address. There's a catalog of contents with an abstract and some pieces of information. Then there's the possibility to join the website. So you have to give a few pieces of data, email, name, surname, necessary for creating an account. And then since the first registration, the user can download every type of content in the catalog. Then this can be downloaded freely, following the normal rules that we have in terms of copyright, of course. Within the portal, there's the possibility to make a query. So we wanted to work on the an easy use, so we can search by keyword, topic, author. We can also refine the research, because now we have 669 articles, if I'm not wrong. So it's a project that it is feeding over the time, and the research on contents is fundamental. Every content has its own information sheet. So it will be an abstract with the typical information needed, the year of the article, the title, the possibility to download the article in a PDF file. The access is easy. It's an open access project. So we need these elements to identify the user. We also have the index of the authors. In alphabetic order of all the authors. When we will have new articles, it will be enlarged. And this is the explanation of the portal. I'm not saying too much. I invite you all to join the website, take a look. And we were, introduced as partners and we feel that we are partners, it is important to have a feedback as well. So we would like to have your feedback of coming from you using these tools, because this gives us the chance to improve. Thank you. I would like to thank you, and I'd like to add a little thing so that I can motivate you to join this website. We will add some new articles and also uh, papers and texts coming from the past, classic text in our catalog. But what we are working on is the implementation of two research activities: the catalog of the corpus of the foundation, and also the limited papers that we have in Italy. And within this framework, these structures will be functional to the accessibility of a heritage that will not be that accessible. I think it's time to have dinner, isn't it? Thank you very much for your patience. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Hai chiuso là?